Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The rusted gate of Millbrook State Forensic Hospital hadn't been locked in 15 years, yet it took considerable force to push it open. The metal groaned against concrete as I slipped through, my flashlight cutting through the October darkness. Dead leaves crunched beneath my boots, each step echoing off the imposing brick facade that rose before me like a monument to forgotten suffering. I'd been tracking this story for months. 23 patients who had simply vanished from Millbrook's records between 1987 and 1991. Their files mysteriously purged from the state database. The official line claimed administrative error, but Dr. Helena Marsh, the hospital's former chief psychiatrist, had contacted me 3 weeks ago with a different story. Before she could elaborate, she'd suffered what her daughter called a complete mental breakdown and was now residing in a private facility 2 states away, speaking only in whispers about files that wouldn't stay closed. The main building's entrance had been welded shut, but I'd done my research. The service entrance on the eastern wing remained accessible, hidden behind overgrown ivy that scraped against my jacket as I pushed through. The door opened with surprising ease, as if it had been recently oiled. Inside, the stale air carried traces of industrial disinfectant mixed with something else, something organic and unpleasant that made my sinuses burn. My flashlight beam revealed yellowed linoleum floors, their surface buckled and cracked from years of neglect. The walls, once painted an institutional green, had faded to the color of old bruises. I'd memorized the hospital's layout from archived blueprints. The administrative wing lay straight ahead, past the common areas and through the security checkpoint. My footsteps seemed unnaturally loud in the silence, each sound multiplying as it bounced off empty doorways and forgotten corners. The first sign that something was amiss came as I passed the nurse's station. A clipboard hung from a hook on the wall, its pages fluttering despite the absence of any breeze. When I aimed my light at it, the movement stopped immediately. I stood motionless for several heartbeats, listening to the building settle around me, before continuing forward. The security checkpoint consisted of 2 heavy doors separated by a small chamber. Both doors stood partially open, their electronic locks dark and useless. I squeezed through, noting the reinforced steel frames and the small observation windows that would have allowed guards to monitor anyone passing between the secure and unsecured areas of the facility. Beyond the checkpoint, the architecture changed. The walls here were thicker, the ceilings lower, and the doors bore small rectangular windows, fitted with heavy mesh screens. This was where they had housed the most dangerous patients, those who had committed violent crimes while mentally ill, those who couldn't be trusted in the general population of a regular psychiatric facility. I found the administrative office at the end of a long corridor. The door had been left ajar, and my light revealed filing cabinets lining 3 walls, their metal surfaces spotted with rust and moisture damage. Most of the drawers hung open, their contents long since removed or destroyed by time and neglect. But one cabinet in the far corner remained pristinely closed, its surface clean and unmarked by the decay that had claimed everything else in the room. A small placard on the front read, "Special Registry, Restricted Access," in crisp, black lettering that looked disturbingly fresh. The top drawer opened smoothly when I pulled the handle. Inside, manila folders sat in perfect order, their edges aligned and their tabs clearly labeled with patient numbers and names. I lifted the first file, noting how the paper felt oddly warm beneath my fingers. The folder contained a standard intake form dated September 15th, 1989. Patient 847C, identified as Marcus Brennan, male, age 34, admitted following an incident involving severe psychotic delusions and paranoid behavior. The photograph stapled to the inside cover showed a gaunt man with dark, hollow eyes that seemed to follow my flashlight beam as I moved it across the page. I flipped through the subsequent pages: medical evaluations, treatment notes, behavioral assessments, all documenting Brennan's deteriorating mental state. The final entry, dated November 3rd, 1989, noted that the patient had become convinced that hospital staff were documenting his thoughts and planning to register him permanently in their system. The handwriting was hasty, almost urgent. Patient exhibits increasing agitation, claims his medical records are being altered when he's not watching, insists his personal history is being rewritten, recommend immediate evaluation for transfer to maximum security wing. That was where the file ended. No discharge papers, no transfer orders, no death certificate. Just empty space where the rest of Marcus Brennan's story should have been. As I set the folder aside and reached for the next, a sound echoed through the building. A low, mechanical whine that seemed to come from everywhere at once. I froze, listening as the sound grew louder, more insistent, until I recognized it as the wail of an evacuation siren. The sound stopped as abruptly as it had begun, leaving my ears ringing in the sudden silence. I waited, counting my heartbeats, before returning my attention to the files. But when I looked down at the folder in my hands, something had changed. The name on the tab now read, Patient 848C, David Chen. I flipped it open, certain I had made a mistake, but the photograph inside showed an Asian man in his 30s, not the gaunt Caucasian from moments before. The intake date remained the same, but every other detail had shifted. David Chen, admitted for paranoid delusions and obsessive documentation behavior. I grabbed the first folder again, the one that had contained Marcus Brennan's information. The tab still bore his name, but when I opened it, the photograph showed a different face entirely. A woman with graying hair and suspicious eyes. The intake form identified her as Patricia Voss, though the patient number remained 847C. My hands began to shake as I spread several folders across the top of the filing cabinet. Each time I looked away and back again, details shifted. Names changed, photographs transformed, dates rearranged themselves. Only the patient numbers remained constant, like fixed coordinates in an otherwise fluid reality. I forced myself to breathe slowly, to think rationally. Stress could cause hallucinations. Poor lighting could create optical illusions. I was alone in a creepy building at night, investigating a potentially dangerous story. My mind was simply playing tricks on me. But when the evacuation siren sounded again, longer this time and accompanied by the distinct click of electronic locks disengaging, I could no longer dismiss what was happening as mere imagination. Through the office doorway, I could see lights flickering on in the corridor beyond, pale fluorescent tubes buzzing to life after years of darkness. I gathered the files and stuffed them into my backpack, telling myself I would examine them properly once I was safely away from this place. But as I turned toward the door, I noticed one more folder lying at the bottom of the drawer, thicker than the others, with a pristine white tab that bore no name or number. Inside, I found my own driver's license photocopied onto an intake form, my address, my social security number, my emergency contact information, all transcribed in the same neat handwriting I'd seen in the other files. The admission date was listed as tonight's date. Under reason for admission, someone had written, Paranoid delusions. Patient believes hospital records are being altered. Claims his personal information is being stolen and documented without consent. The photograph stapled to the form was my own press badge photo, but my eyes in the image looked different, wider, more frightened, with the same hollow quality I'd seen in the faces of the other patients. I slammed the folder shut and stumbled backward, but my foot caught on something, and I fell heavily against the filing cabinet. Folders scattered across the floor, their contents spilling in white cascades across the yellowed linoleum. As I scrambled to gather them up, I saw that every single page now bore my name, my photograph, my personal details repeated endlessly in slight variations. The sirens were constant now, their wail rising and falling in hypnotic waves. Through the mesh-covered window, I could see lights moving in the corridor. Not the steady glow of fluorescent tubes, but the wandering beams of flashlights carried by figures I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. I grabbed my backpack and ran for the door, but the corridor beyond had changed. Where there had been a straight path back to the security checkpoint, I now found myself facing a maze of branching hallways, each one lined with doors that hung open like gaping mouths. The walls were covered with pages torn from files, thousands of intake forms and medical reports that fluttered in an unfelt breeze. My own name appeared on every visible page. The sound of footsteps echoed from somewhere behind me, measured, purposeful steps that seemed to be gaining ground no matter which direction I ran. I chose a corridor at random and sprinted down it, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across walls that seemed to pulse and shift in my peripheral vision. I tried door after door, but each one opened onto rooms that made no architectural sense, spaces that were too large for the building's footprint, chambers that curved impossibly back on themselves, cells with no apparent exits except for the doors through which I'd entered. In every room, filing cabinets lined the walls, their drawers hanging open to reveal endless rows of folders, all bearing my name in various iterations. Finally, I found a stairwell and climbed frantically toward what I hoped would be an exit to the roof. But the stairs seemed to go on forever, flight after flight ascending into darkness that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. My legs burned with exhaustion, my lungs gasped for air that tasted increasingly of disinfectant and decay. When I finally reached what appeared to be the top floor, I found myself in a circular room with no windows and no doors, except for the one through which I'd entered. Filing cabinets covered every inch of wall space, creating a perfect ring around the chamber's perimeter. In the center of the room stood a single desk with an old-fashioned typewriter, its keys clicking away by themselves, producing page after page of text that curled out of the machine and fell to the floor in endless, rustling streams. I approached the typewriter with trembling steps. The pages scattered around it were all intake forms, each one documenting my admission to Millbrook State Forensic Hospital. But the dates varied wildly. Some showed tonight's date, others reached back decades, and still others projected years into the future. All of them described the same patient, a paranoid individual convinced that a defunct psychiatric hospital was trying to register him as a permanent resident. The typing stopped suddenly, leaving the room in absolute silence. In the quiet, I could hear my own heartbeat, rapid and irregular, and the soft rustle of papers settling around my feet. I reached out to touch the typewriter, but my hand passed through it as if it were made of smoke. That was when I understood. The building hadn't been documenting me. I had been documenting myself. Every step I'd taken, every file I'd opened, every detail I'd observed had been feeding into some vast system of record-keeping that existed only in the spaces between reality and delusion. I pulled out my phone to call for help, but the screen showed no signal, no battery, no time. The device felt hollow in my hands like a prop in an elaborate stage production. When I tried to remember how I'd arrived at the hospital, the memory felt thin and uncertain. Had I driven here? Walked? The more I focused on the question, the more the answer seemed to slip away. The evacuation sirens had stopped, but in their place came a new sound, the steady scratch of pencils on paper, coming from somewhere beyond the walls. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, all writing simultaneously, documenting something vast and incomprehensible. I opened my backpack to examine the files I'd collected, but found only blank pages. When I tried to write my name on one of them, the pencil left no mark. When I spoke aloud, my voice made no sound. I had become a ghost in my own investigation, a presence that could observe but no longer influence. The room began to change around me. The filing cabinets multiplied, their drawers breeding new drawers, creating an infinite recursion of storage space. The scattered papers on the floor organized themselves into neat piles, then merged into towering columns that stretched toward a ceiling I could no longer see. In the growing maze of documents, I caught glimpses of other figures, shadowy forms that moved between the files with purposeful efficiency. They paid no attention to me, focused entirely on their endless task of sorting, filing, cross-referencing. Sometimes I recognized faces from the patient photographs, but when I looked directly at them, they faded like smoke. I don't know how long I wandered through that ever-expanding archive. Time seemed to have lost all meaning in the space between the files. Sometimes I found myself back in the original office, watching my own hands open folders that revealed my own information. Other times I stood outside the hospital, staring up at windows that flickered with the pale glow of fluorescent lights, knowing that somewhere inside, new pages were being added to my file. The worst part was the growing certainty that I had never been investigating a story about missing patients. I was the missing patient, had always been the missing patient, would always be the missing patient. The journalists, the phone calls, the research, all of it was just another layer of documentation in a file that grew thicker with each passing moment. Now, as I sit in what might be my old apartment, or might be a room designed to look like my old apartment, typing these words on a computer that may or may not exist, I wonder if this account will become just another page in my permanent record. The cursor blinks steadily on the screen, waiting for me to continue, but I'm no longer sure what story I'm supposed to be telling. Outside my window, if it is a window, I can see the silhouette of Millbrook State Forensic Hospital against the pre-dawn sky. Its windows glow with steady light, and I know that somewhere inside, filing cabinets stretch in all directions, their drawers filled with infinite variations of the same story. My story. The story of a man who thought he was documenting others, only to discover that he himself was the one being documented. The evacuation sirens have started again. Story 2. The rust-stained sign emerged from the darkness like a warning nobody heeded, its metal surface catching our headlights for barely 3 seconds before we passed it. Old Creek Road, 12 miles. The letters were faded, eaten by weather and time, but Marcus insisted we take the detour. Said it would cut an hour off our drive back to campus. I should have kept going straight. The asphalt gave way to packed dirt within minutes, and our conversation died with the smooth hum of tires on pavement. Dust kicked up behind us in the rearview mirror, a ghostly plume that seemed to glow in our taillights. That's when I first noticed them. The headlights following us, maintaining a steady distance of maybe 200 yards back. I mentioned it to the others, keeping my voice casual. Marcus leaned forward from the passenger seat to check the side mirror, while Jake, Sarah, and Tom craned their necks to peer through the rear window. The lights were there, 2 perfect orbs cutting through the darkness, neither gaining nor falling behind. Probably just another group of college kids, Sarah said, settling back into her seat. Everyone's trying to get back before Monday. But something felt wrong about those lights. They were too steady, too precise in their distance. When I eased off the gas pedal, testing, the speedometer dropped from 55 to 45. The lights behind us should have grown larger, closer. Instead, they simply weren't there anymore. The road stretched empty and black in my mirrors. I pressed the accelerator again, bringing us back up to speed, and within 30 seconds, the lights reappeared. Same distance, same unwavering position. My palms began to sweat against the steering wheel. The others had resumed their conversation about Professor Mitchell's upcoming exam, their voices forming a comfortable backdrop to the engine's rumble. I tried to focus on their words, to let the normalcy of their discussion ease the growing knot in my stomach, but my eyes kept flicking to the mirrors. The road curved through what felt like endless farmland, though the darkness made it impossible to see beyond the reach of our headlights. Occasionally, a fence post or a withered tree would materialize at the edge of our light cone before vanishing again into the night. The landscape felt abandoned, forgotten, as if we were driving through some liminal space between the world we knew and somewhere else entirely. 20 minutes passed, then 30. The GPS on my phone had lost signal miles back, and none of us had thought to question whether this detour was actually shorter. We just kept following the narrow dirt road as it wound deeper into the countryside, trusting that it would eventually lead us back to civilization. That's when we saw the gas station. It materialized out of the darkness like something from a different era. A single-story building with faded blue siding and a corrugated metal awning stretched over 2 ancient pumps. No lights illuminated the structure, and the windows were too grimy to see through. But a hand-painted sign still hung above the door, Pete's Last Stop. My fuel gauge had been dancing near empty for the last 10 miles, and despite the station's obviously abandoned state, I found myself pulling into the lot. The gravel crunched under our tires as we rolled to a stop beside the nearer pump. The headlights that had been following us were nowhere to be seen. "This place looks like it's been closed for decades," Tom observed, his voice carrying a note of unease that matched my own feelings. The building squatted in our headlights like a sleeping creature. Paint peeled from its walls in long strips, and weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete around the pumps. But as I sat there debating whether to risk running out of gas or continue on the unknown road ahead, something impossible happened. The pump beside my driver's door clicked to life. The digital display that should have been dark and dead flickered once, twice, then glowed a steady green. Numbers began appearing. $3.49 per gallon, the same price gas had been 3 years ago. The pump hummed softly, waiting. "What the hell?" Marcus whispered. I stared at the display, my mouth dry. The pump couldn't possibly be working. There were no lights on in the building, no signs of electricity anywhere. Yet the machine hummed patiently beside my window, its screen bright and inviting. The others had gone silent. I could feel their eyes on me, waiting for me to make sense of what we were seeing. But sense was the last thing any of this made. My hands trembled as I reached for the door handle. The night air was cooler than I'd expected, carrying scents of dust and something else. Something organic and slightly sweet, like flowers left too long in stagnant water. The pump's hum seemed louder now that I was outside the car, a steady electrical vibration that I could feel in my chest. I lifted the nozzle with hands that wouldn't quite stop shaking. The metal was warm, as if it had been sitting in sunlight rather than abandonment. When I squeezed the handle, gasoline flowed immediately. No card needed, no prepayment required. Just gas, flowing into my tank as if this were the most natural thing in the world. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was watching the numbers climb on the display, watching them climb to exactly 23:67 before the pump clicked off by itself. Exactly the amount needed to fill my tank from the quarter mark where the gauge had been sitting. I replaced the nozzle with movements that felt disconnected from my own body, as if I were watching someone else perform these actions from a great distance. The pump's display flickered once more, then went dark. The humming stopped. Whatever force had brought the machine to life was gone, leaving only silence and the smell of gasoline hanging in the air. When I climbed back into the car, nobody spoke for a full minute. Finally, Jake cleared his throat from the back seat. "How is that possible?" I had no answer. I started the engine and pulled away from the station, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. In the rearview mirror, I watched the building disappear into darkness, as if it had never existed at all. That's when the radio started acting up. At first, it was just static between stations, the kind of interference you might expect in rural areas. But as I searched for something to break the oppressive silence, I began to notice a pattern in the white noise. Voices, distant and distorted, bleeding through from some unknown frequency. I found a classical station that came through relatively clear and left it there, hoping the familiar strains of orchestral music would help settle my nerves. For a few minutes, it worked. Mozart's Piano Concerto No. 21 filled the car with its gentle melody, and I felt some of the tension leave my shoulders. Then Marcus commented on how the piece reminded him of his sister's piano recitals, and a few seconds later, those same words echoed faintly from the radio speakers. Not the exact words, the quality was too poor for that, but the cadence, the inflection, unmistakably Marcus's voice. "Did you guys hear that?" Sarah asked, and moments later, a distorted version of her question whispered through the static. I reached for the radio dial with a hand that was definitely shaking now. As I turned it, searching for another station, fragments of our conversation continued to leak through the speakers. Tom's nervous laugh. Jake mentioning that the road seemed to be curving back on itself. My own voice saying we should find a place to turn around. Everything delayed by 3 or 4 seconds. Everything slightly wrong, as if someone were repeating our words back to us from memory, getting close but never quite perfect. I turned the radio off. The silence that followed felt heavy, oppressive. Outside our bubble of light, the world stretched endlessly in all directions, featureless and dark. The road continued to wind through the empty landscape, But now I was beginning to wonder if we were actually making progress, or simply driving in some vast circle, trapped in a loop we couldn't see. "How long have we been on this road?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. Marcus checked his phone. "About an hour, but..." He frowned at the screen. "That can't be right. It says it's been 2.5 hours since we left campus." "Let me see that." Tom leaned forward and looked at the phone's display. After a moment, he said quietly, "That's what mine shows too." I glanced at the clock on the dashboard. 3:47 a.m. We'd left campus just after midnight, and the detour was supposed to save us an hour. Even accounting for the stop at the gas station, we should have been back on the main highway by now. Instead, we were still following this nameless dirt road through nowhere, with no signs of civilization except for an impossible gas station that might not even exist. The headlights appeared in my mirrors again. Same distance, same steady presence, but now I was certain they hadn't been there when we'd pulled away from the gas station. They'd simply materialized, as if they'd been waiting for us to notice them again. I tested them once more, slowing down gradually. The lights vanished. I sped up, and they returned, always maintaining that perfect distance. Never closer, never farther away. "We're being followed," I said, my voice sounding strange in the enclosed space of the car. The others turned to look, but as soon as they did, the lights disappeared. Only when they faced forward again did the headlights return, visible only in my peripheral vision and in the mirrors. "I don't see anything," Jake said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty now. "They're there." I was certain, though I was beginning to doubt my own certainty about everything else. "They've been following us since we turned onto this road. Maybe we should pull over," Sarah suggested. "Let them pass." The idea filled me with inexplicable dread. The thought of stopping on this empty road, of sitting in the darkness while those strange lights approached, made my skin crawl. "No, we keep moving." But moving where? The road stretched ahead without variation, no intersections, no signs, no landmarks of any kind, just endless dirt and darkness, as if we were driving through a void. The fuel gauge showed full, thanks to our impossible stop at Pete's last stop, but I was beginning to wonder if that mattered. If we were trapped in some kind of loop, would we ever actually run out of gas? Would we ever reach our destination? Or would we just keep driving forever through this empty landscape, followed by lights that disappeared whenever anyone else tried to see them? The radio crackled to life on its own. This time there was no music, no stations bleeding through from the outside world. Just our voices, all of our voices, having a conversation none of us remembered having. We listened to ourselves discussing whether to turn around, whether to trust the GPS, whether this was all just a big mistake. But the words were wrong somehow, subtly altered, as if someone were improvising variations on a theme they'd heard before. I reached for the dial again, but before I could turn it off, my own voice came through the speakers, clear as day. We should have stayed on the main road. Except I hadn't said that, not out loud. I'd been thinking it, but I hadn't spoken. The others stared at the radio, then at me. In the green glow of the dashboard lights, their faces looked pale and strange, like people I'd never seen before. "Did I just..." I started to ask, but the radio cut me off with a burst of static. When the interference cleared, we could hear ourselves again. But this time, the conversation was happening in real time. Every word we spoke echoed back to us through the speakers with that same slight delay, that same imperfect reproduction. Tom reached over and yanked the radio's power cord from its socket. The voices continued. Now they were coming from all around us. The speakers, yes, but also from outside the car somehow, as if a group of people were walking alongside us in the darkness, just beyond the reach of our headlights, carrying on a conversation that mirrored our own. I could hear the crunch of their footsteps on gravel, keeping perfect pace with our vehicle. "This isn't happening," Sarah whispered, and her whisper echoed back to us from the night outside. I pressed the accelerator harder, pushing our speed up to 60, then 70. The engine strained against the rough road, and the car bounced and lurched over ruts and potholes. But the footsteps kept pace. The voices continued their strange mimicry, always a few seconds behind, always slightly wrong. Ahead, a shape loomed out of the darkness. Another building, larger than the gas station, with a tall sign that might once have advertised a motel or restaurant. As we approached, I could make out broken windows and a collapsed section of roof. Whatever this place had been, it was abandoned now, left to decay in the middle of nowhere. But light glowed in one of the windows. Warm, yellow light, like a fire burning in a fireplace. I drove past without slowing down, but in the brief moment when we were alongside the building, I could swear I saw figures moving behind that lit window. 5 figures, sitting around what might have been a table, their silhouettes clearly visible. In the rearview mirror, I watched the building disappear into darkness. The light was gone, as if it had never been there at all. "Did you see?" Marcus began, but his question was immediately repeated back to us by the voices outside the car. "We need to turn around," I said, my voice cracking. "We need to go back." But even as I said it, I realized there was nowhere to turn around. The road was barely wide enough for our car, with deep ditches on either side and no shoulder to speak of. We could only go forward, deeper into whatever strange territory we'd stumbled into. The headlights behind us pulsed once, twice, like someone flashing their high beams. When I looked in the mirror, they seemed closer than before, though I couldn't be sure. Distance was becoming difficult to judge in this endless darkness. My hands were shaking so badly now that I could barely keep the car steady. The voices outside continued their distorted conversation, and I was beginning to recognize not just our words but our inflections, our speech patterns, as if someone had been studying us for a very long time. "How do they know us?" Jake asked from the back seat, his voice small and frightened. "How do they know us?" The night echoed back. That's when I understood. Or thought I understood. The truth was too large and too terrible to fully grasp, but I could feel its edges pressing against my consciousness like shadows at the periphery of vision. We weren't being followed. We were following ourselves. Those headlights in the mirror, the voices outside, the figures in the abandoned building, they were us. Trapped in some kind of temporal loop, endlessly driving this road while other versions of ourselves drove it behind us and ahead of us and all around us in dimensions we couldn't perceive. The gas station hadn't been abandoned. It had been waiting for us, because we'd been there before, would be there again. The pump had known exactly how much fuel we needed because this was a story that had already been written, was being written, would always be written. I looked at my friends, Marcus studying his phone with a puzzled expression, Sarah staring out the window at the darkness, Tom and Jake whispering to each other in the back seat, and I wondered if they were real. If I was real, if any of this was happening for the first time, or if we were just echoes ourselves, shadows cast by some original event that had occurred so long ago that the source was lost to memory. The road curved ahead, and in the distance I could see a faint glow. As we drew closer, it resolved into a familiar shape, a single-story building with faded blue siding and a corrugated metal awning stretched over 2 ancient pumps. Pete's last stop. "Didn't we just..." Tom started to say, but his words trailed off as he recognized what we were seeing. The building looked exactly the same as before, down to the weeds growing through the cracks in the concrete, but now there was another car parked beside the far pump, a car that looked exactly like ours, down to the dent in the rear bumper that Marcus had put there 3 months ago. As we pulled into the lot, our headlights illuminated 5 figures standing around the other car. They turned to look at us, and in the brief moment before the angle changed and shadows obscured their faces, I saw myself looking back. The pump beside my door clicked to life, its display glowing green in the darkness. 3.49 per gallon, waiting. I turned off the engine and sat in the spreading silence, listening to our doubles outside discussing whether to risk running out of gas or continue on the unknown road ahead. Their voices were clearer now, no longer distorted by radio static or distance. They were having the exact conversation we'd had 20 minutes ago, or 20 years ago, or 20 minutes from now. Time had become meaningless on this road. Cause and effect had collapsed into a single eternal moment of driving through darkness, followed by lights that might be our past or our future, listening to voices that might be our own. I reached for the door handle, knowing I had no choice but to play my part in this endless repetition. Behind us, new headlights appeared in the mirrors, maintaining their perfect distance. Ahead, the road curved into darkness, leading nowhere and everywhere at once. The pump hummed patiently, waiting to dispense exactly $23.67 worth of gasoline into a tank that would never truly empty, on a road that would never truly end. I stepped out into the night air, breathing in the scent of dust and decay and something else, something that might have been time itself, rotting at the edges where it had been bent into impossible shapes. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear the faint sound of an engine approaching. New travelers, perhaps, following a rust-stained sign that promised a shortcut. Soon they would see the headlights behind them. Soon they would find the gas station. Soon they would hear their own voices whispering back to them from the darkness. And we would still be here, driving this road forever, trapped in the space between one moment and the next, in the eternal echo of a choice we'd made and would make and were making in endless repetition. The pump's display flickered in the darkness, patient and eternal, waiting. Story 3. The rusted chain-link fence had been cut long before I arrived. Its edges curled back like metal petals wilted by time and weather. Beyond it, the abandoned riverside hydroelectric plant squatted against the gray October sky like a concrete tumor on the riverbank. I'd driven 3 hours to reach this place, drawn by urban exploration forums that whispered about its photogenic decay and the strange acoustics that carried voices from empty chambers. My camera bag felt heavier than usual as I ducked through the gap in the fence, boots crunching on broken glass and scattered debris. The air smelled of rust and stagnant water, with an underlying sweetness that reminded me of flowers left too long in a vase. I'd been photographing abandoned places for 5 years, but something about this location felt different, more watchful, more alive despite its obvious death. The main building loomed before me, its windows dark and fractured like dead eyes. Graffiti covered the lower walls in layers, each tagger adding their mark to the palimpsest of urban decay. I raised my camera and took my first shot, the flash illuminating the facade for a split second before darkness reclaimed it. The sound echoed strangely, bouncing off concrete surfaces with a delay that seemed too long for the space. Inside, the reception area was a cavern of shadows and dust motes, dancing in shafts of weak sunlight. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness, each sound amplified and distorted by the cavernous space. The air was thick with decades of abandonment, pressing against my skin like a physical weight. I moved deeper into the building, following corridors lined with empty doorframes and walls streaked with water damage. The generator room was what I'd come for. Massive turbines frozen in rust, their blades caught mid-rotation like the hands of a stopped clock. Industrial pipes snaked along the ceiling, some broken and hanging at odd angles. I spent an hour here, capturing the interplay of light and shadow, the beautiful decay that made these places so compelling. Each flash illuminated details I hadn't noticed. Cables that seemed to writhe in the brief illumination, shadows that moved independently of their sources. It was while backing up to frame a wider shot that I felt the floor give way beneath my right foot. The rotted planking collapsed with a wet, cracking sound, and I plunged through into darkness below. The fall was shorter than I'd expected, maybe 8 feet, but I landed hard in cold water that soaked through my jeans immediately. The smell hit me like a physical blow, stagnant water mixed with something else, something organic and wrong. I found myself in what must have been a maintenance area beneath the main floor, the water reaching just past my knees. My flashlight beam revealed concrete columns stretching into the darkness, their surfaces slick with moisture and something that might have been algae. The water was darker than it should have been, almost black, and when I moved it created ripples that caught the light strangely, as if the liquid were thicker than water should be. That's when I noticed the lights. Industrial fixtures hung from the ceiling at irregular intervals, their bulbs dark, and obviously disconnected from any power source. Yet as I watched, one of them began to flicker, a weak yellowish pulse that lasted for several seconds before dying again. Then another started, and another, creating a random pattern of illumination that cast dancing shadows on the walls. I raised my camera instinctively, muscle memory overriding confusion. The flash fired, bright and harsh in the confined space. And in that brief moment of illumination, I saw them clearly. Figures standing between the columns, their forms indistinct but unmistakably human. They wore what looked like oversized rubber gloves that extended up their arms, the yellow material catching the light with an oily sheen. Their faces remained hidden in shadow, but I could feel their attention focused on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The flash faded, plunging the space back into the irregular rhythm of the blinking lights. The figures were gone, or rather, I could no longer see them clearly. But the sense of being watched remained, pressing against me from all directions. I took another photo, and another, each flash revealing glimpses of movement in my peripheral vision, shapes that shouldn't exist in an abandoned building. It was after the fourth or fifth photo that I noticed the water level had risen. Where it had reached just past my knees before, it now lapped at my mid-thigh. I hadn't moved to a deeper area. I was standing in the same spot, but the water was definitely higher. A chill that had nothing to do with the cold liquid crept up my spine. I took another picture, focusing on the nearest column to see if I could capture whatever was moving in the shadows. The flash illuminated the concrete pillar clearly, and for a moment I thought I saw handprints on its surface, not made by hands wearing gloves, but the reverse impressions, as if the gloves themselves had left their mark in the concrete. The water rose again. This time, I was certain. Each flash of my camera was somehow connected to the rising water level. The correlation was impossible, defying every law of physics I understood, but the evidence was literally soaking through my clothes. I looked around frantically for the source, broken pipes maybe, or some kind of valve triggered by the camera's electronic flash. But the concrete walls revealed nothing. The blinking lights seemed to respond to my growing panic, their rhythm becoming faster and more erratic. In their intermittent glow, I caught more glimpses of the figures. They weren't moving closer exactly, but there seemed to be more of them, standing silent and patient among the columns. The rubber gloves they wore reflected the sporadic lighting with an unsettling gleam, as if they were wet with something other than water. I forced myself to think rationally. There had to be an explanation. Old buildings were full of triggered mechanisms, pressure plates, automated systems that might still function decades after abandonment. The figures could be hallucinations brought on by stress and the strange lighting conditions. People saw things in flickering light. It was a well-documented phenomenon. But the water was undeniably real, and it was still rising. I waded toward what I hoped was an exit, my movements creating small waves that spread out in concentric circles. The sound of displaced water echoed off the walls with a hollow, haunting quality. Behind me, I could hear other sounds now, soft splashing that matched no rhythm of my own movement, as if others were walking through the flood. The beam of my flashlight swept across the far wall, revealing a heavy metal door set into the concrete. It looked like some kind of maintenance access or emergency exit. As I approached, I could see that it was secured by an electronic lock system, its LED display glowing a steady red. The sight of functional electronics in this derelict place should have been reassuring, but instead it filled me with unease. The control panel beside the door was more complex than I'd expected, with multiple switches and indicators. Most were dark, but several showed green lights, and there was a small screen displaying text I couldn't read from my current position. I splashed closer, the water now reaching my waist, and squinted at the display. The text was in English, but the words seemed to shift and blur when I tried to focus on them. Something about safety protocols and illumination sources. One phrase stood out. All external lighting must be deactivated before emergency procedures can commence. I looked down at the flashlight in my hand, its beam cutting through the murky water to illuminate my submerged legs. Then I noticed my camera, still hanging around my neck, its LCD screen glowing softly in the darkness. External lighting. The flash, the LED screens, my flashlight. all sources of illumination that somehow needed to be turned off. But that would mean complete darkness, and the thought of being blind in this flooded chamber with those watching figures sent waves of panic through my chest. The water was still rising, though, now reaching the bottom of my ribcage. I had to make a choice. I took one last photograph, capturing the scene around me in all its impossible wrongness. In the harsh illumination of the flash, the figures were everywhere, dozens of them, standing perfectly still in the dark water, their rubber-gloved hands hanging at their sides. They filled every space between the columns, a silent audience to my growing desperation. The water jumped another few inches. My hands shaking, I switched off the flashlight first. The darkness was immediate and absolute, broken only by the irregular blinking of the overhead lights and the soft glow of my camera's display. I fumbled with the camera's controls, my fingers numb with cold and fear, until I found the power button. The last source of light died, leaving only the random pattern of the blinking industrial fixtures. But even those were fading now, their intervals growing longer, their illumination weaker. One by one, they went dark, until I stood in perfect blackness, surrounded by the sound of gently lapping water and my own ragged breathing. I heard the door mechanism engage with a heavy clunk, followed by the whir of motors and the screech of metal on metal. A thin line of light appeared at the bottom of the door, growing wider as it swung open. Beyond it, I could see what looked like a concrete stairway leading upward. I didn't run. Running would have been impossible in water that now reached my chest, but I moved as quickly as I could toward the exit. The liquid seemed to resist my movement, thick and clinging, and I had the horrible sensation that hands were brushing against my legs beneath the surface. Just before I reached the doorway, the last of the overhead lights gave one final brilliant flash. In that moment of illumination, I saw that the chamber behind me was empty. No figures, no watchers in rubber gloves, just concrete columns rising from dark water like the ribs of some massive, drowned beast. I stumbled through the doorway and up the stairs, not stopping until I emerged into the fading daylight outside the plant. My clothes were soaked through, leaving a trail of dark, foul-smelling water in my wake. I didn't look back at the building as I walked to my car, didn't turn around even when I heard what sounded like whispers carried on the wind. It wasn't until I was halfway home that I remembered to check my camera. The memory card was empty. Every photograph I'd taken inside the plant was gone, leaving no evidence of what I'd experienced. But when I looked at my clothes in the rearview mirror, I could see the waterline clearly marked on my shirt, dark and unmistakable. The next morning, I found news articles about the Riverside plant online. According to multiple sources, the lower level had been sealed off for decades, following a catastrophic flood that had killed several maintenance workers. The articles mentioned that their bodies had never been recovered. But when I tried to find the articles again the next day, searching with the same terms and following the same links, I found nothing. The plant didn't seem to exist in any official records, and the road I'd taken to reach it didn't appear on any map I could find. Sometimes late at night, I feel dampness seeping through my clothes for no reason I can determine. When that happens, I check my camera, half expecting to find photographs I don't remember taking. So far, the memory card remains empty, but I keep checking, because I know that one day I'll find something there. Images of concrete columns and dark water, and figures wearing rubber gloves, standing patient and still in the depths below. Story 4. The charcoal smell hit us first. That acrid, decades-old stench of burnt opulence that seemed to seep from the very walls of the Grandview Hotel. Sarah had convinced our entire studio group to make this expedition. Her enthusiasm for authentic architectural decay, infectious enough to drag 5 of us through a gap in the chain-link fence on a gray October morning. The hotel had been abandoned since the fire of 1974, she'd explained, a perfect case study in how disaster transforms space. I should have known better than to follow Sarah into one of her obsessions. The lobby stretched before us like the ribcage of some massive beast. Its ornate ceiling collapsed in sections, revealing twisted steel and dangling wires that swayed in drafts we couldn't feel. Burnt velvet wallpaper hung in strips, and what remained of the marble floor was cracked and stained with decades of rain damage. Sarah moved through it all with the focused intensity of a pilgrim approaching a shrine, her camera clicking rapidly as she documented angles and deterioration patterns. While she photographed, I sketched floor plans in my notebook, measuring distances with practiced steps and noting structural damage. The others had scattered, Marcus heading toward what remained of the restaurant, Jenny and David exploring the mezzanine level. The building felt impossibly vast around us, our voices echoing strangely in spaces that should have absorbed sound, but instead seemed to amplify and distort it. Sarah disappeared down a corridor while I worked on mapping the lobby's proportions. The silence that followed her departure felt different somehow, not empty, but expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I finished my rough sketch and called her name, receiving only the hollow echo of my own voice in response. The hallway I followed had once been grand. Traces of gold leaf clung to wall moldings, and the burnt carpet beneath my feet still showed patterns of deep burgundy and navy. Emergency lighting fixtures hung at odd angles, their plastic covers melted into abstract shapes that cast strange shadows when my flashlight beam hit them. The smell grew stronger here, not just smoke damage, but something else underneath, something sweet and cloying that made my stomach clench. I found Sarah 3 doors down, standing motionless in what had been a luxury suite. The room was gutted, its windows blown out and furniture reduced to twisted metal frames and springs. But Sarah wasn't looking at the destruction. She stood transfixed before a full-length mirror that somehow remained intact against the far wall, its ornate frame untouched by the flames that had consumed everything around it. The mirror's surface was perfect, reflecting not the charred ruin we stood in, but a pristine hallway. Warm light spilled from crystal chandeliers that should have been melted slag, illuminating burgundy carpeting that looked freshly vacuumed. The wallpaper in the reflection showed intricate damask patterns in gold and cream, unmarred by smoke or time. Soft instrumental music seemed to drift from somewhere beyond the glass, not heard exactly, but felt as a barely perceptible vibration in the air. Sarah's hand hovered inches from the mirror's surface, trembling slightly. She spoke without turning around, her voice barely above a whisper. She said the reflection was impossible, that mirrors couldn't show what wasn't there, but her words carried no conviction. She sounded like someone trying to convince herself of something she no longer believed. I stepped closer, my own reflection appearing beside hers in that pristine hallway. We looked out of place there, 2 figures in jeans and work boots standing in a space that demanded evening gowns and suits. But even as I watched, my reflection began to change. Not my appearance, but my position. While I stood directly in front of the mirror, my reflection seemed to be taking small steps backward, moving deeper into that impossible hallway. The sensation was nauseating, like motion sickness combined with vertigo. I reached out to steady myself against the mirror's frame, and my reflection reached out too. But its hand never quite aligned with mine. There was a delay, a distance that grew with each passing second. My reflected self was now standing several feet behind where it should have been, as if I was looking at myself from the far end of a long corridor. Sarah grabbed my wrist, her fingers ice cold against my skin. She told me not to touch the glass, that something was wrong, that we needed to leave. But I was already reaching out, my fingertips making contact with the mirror's surface. The glass was warm, impossibly warm, like skin that had been sitting in sunlight. The moment I touched it, my reflection took 3 quick steps backward, moving deeper into that pristine hallway until it became a distant figure barely visible in the warm light. The music grew slightly louder, and I could swear I heard the soft ding of an elevator arriving at a floor somewhere in the reflection's depths. I pressed my palm flat against the mirror, trying to understand what I was seeing. My reflection mimicked the gesture, but from what looked like 30 feet away, its movements arriving seconds after mine like an echo made visible. The warm glass seemed to pulse under my hand, and for a moment I felt something pulse back. Not my own heartbeat, but something else, something that matched no human rhythm. That's when I heard the footsteps. They came from behind my reflection, soft and professional on thick carpet. In the mirror, A figure in a dark uniform moved past the far end of the hallway, too distant to make out clearly, but unmistakably human in its purposeful gait. A hotel employee, perhaps, making rounds through corridors that no longer existed. Sarah's grip on my wrist tightened painfully. She pulled me away from the mirror, but I couldn't stop staring at the reflection. More figures were moving now, shadowy forms that crossed the distant hallway at regular intervals. A woman in what looked like a maid's uniform pushed a cart laden with towels. A man in a suit checked his watch before disappearing around a corner. The warm light never wavered, the music never stopped, and the burgundy carpet showed no signs of the countless feet that should have worn it thin. I yanked my hand away from the glass, and my reflection snapped back to its proper position like a rubber band returning to form. The sudden movement made me stumble backward, and Sarah caught my arm to steady me. In the mirror, our reflections stood exactly where they should, but something in their posture seemed wrong, too straight, too still, like mannequins arranged to approximate human beings. We left the room quickly, but I could feel the mirror's presence behind us like a weight pressing between my shoulder blades. The hallway seemed longer on the way out, stretching endlessly ahead of us as our footsteps echoed in the damaged space. Sarah walked beside me in silence, her camera hanging unused around her neck. When I glanced at her, her face was pale and drawn, her eyes fixed straight ahead as if she was afraid to look at anything too closely. The others were waiting in the lobby, their voices loud and cheerful as they compared photographs and shared discoveries. Marcus had found the hotel's original blueprints in a fire-damaged office. Jenny had photographed the remains of the grand ballroom. David had discovered a service elevator shaft that still showed its original Art Deco metalwork. They chattered excitedly about their finds, planning return visits, and discussing research angles for their final projects. Sarah and I said nothing about the mirror. Over the next few days, I found myself thinking about that reflection constantly. In class, while professors discussed load-bearing structures and sustainable materials, I would sketch the mirror's ornate frame in the margins of my notebook. At night, I dreamed of walking through pristine hotel corridors, following the sound of footsteps that stayed always just around the next corner. I woke with the taste of that sweet, cloying smell in my mouth and the memory of warm light on my skin. Sarah seemed to be having similar experiences. She grew increasingly distant during our studio sessions, her usual enthusiasm replaced by a distracted intensity that worried our professors. When she did speak about the hotel, she focused obsessively on its history, researching the 1974 fire with an attention to detail that bordered on compulsive. She discovered that 17 people had been trapped on the upper floors during the blaze, rescued only after hours of uncertainty about their fate. She found insurance reports that described the building's elaborate mirror work, particularly in the luxury suites where wealthy guests had expected their accommodations to reflect their status in every possible way. She never mentioned what we had seen in that suite, but I caught her staring at reflective surfaces with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. In the polished windows of our studio classroom, in the chrome fixtures of the university bathrooms, in the black screen of her laptop when it was turned off, she would pause and stare, as if expecting something to move independently of its source. 2 weeks after our visit, I returned to the hotel alone. I told myself it was for research purposes, that I needed better documentation of the structural damage for my semester project. But I knew I was lying. I needed to see the mirror again, needed to understand what we had witnessed. The rational part of my mind insisted that we had experienced some kind of shared hallucination, perhaps triggered by carbon monoxide from old fire damage, or the psychological effect of being in such a disturbing space. But rationality felt thin and inadequate when measured against the memory of that warm glass and the impossible warmth of those reflected corridors. The hotel felt different in the late afternoon light. Shadows stretched longer through the broken windows, and the silence seemed more complete, as if the building had settled deeper into its abandonment. I made my way to the suite without hesitation, my feet finding the path automatically despite the debris and damage. The mirror was exactly as we had left it, pristine and perfect in its frame of twisted metal and scorched plaster. But the reflection it showed had changed. The hallway was still there, still warm and welcoming, but it was empty now. No shadowy figures crossed its distant intersections. No soft footsteps echoed on its thick carpet. The music was fainter too, barely perceptible even when I pressed my ear close to the glass. I stood before the mirror for a long time, studying my reflection as it stood exactly where it should. The warm light spilled over my reflected form, making my jeans and work boots look out of place in that elegant space. I raised my hand slowly, watching my reflection mirror the movement with perfect synchronization. Everything was normal, exactly as it should be. Then I heard the sound Sarah and I had both somehow forgotten to mention to each other, the soft jingle of keys on a ring, metal against metal in a rhythm that suggested someone walking with purpose. The sound came from somewhere behind my reflection, deeper in that impossible hallway, growing gradually louder, as if approaching from a great distance. My reflection began to move. This time, it didn't step backward. Instead, it turned slowly to look over its shoulder, toward the source of that approaching sound. I remained facing forward, my hand still raised, but my reflection had turned away as if to greet someone I couldn't see. The jingling grew louder, accompanied now by the soft sound of leather soles on thick carpet. In the mirror, a figure emerged from the depths of that perfect hallway. It wore the dark uniform of hotel staff, complete with brass buttons and a name tag that caught the warm light. The figure carried a large ring of old-fashioned keys, the source of the metallic jingling that had grown steadily in volume. As it approached my reflection, I could see its face clearly for the first time. It was my own face, but different. Older, perhaps, or simply marked by experiences I had never had. This other version of myself wore an expression of professional courtesy, mixed with something that might have been concern. It spoke to my reflection in a voice I recognized but had never heard myself use. Formal, deferential, trained to anticipate the needs of guests who expected perfection. The conversation was brief. My reflection nodded several times, accepting what seemed to be instructions or information. Then both figures, my reflection and this uniformed version of myself, turned to look directly at me through the mirror. 4 eyes that were mine but not mine studied me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The uniformed figure raised its keys and jingled them once, deliberately, as if signaling something I was supposed to understand. I stumbled backward from the mirror, my heart hammering against my ribs. In the reflection, both figures watched me retreat, their expressions unchanged. As I reached the doorway, I heard the uniformed figure speak again, its words muffled by the glass but unmistakably addressing me. It said that my room was ready, that I had been expected, that the staff had been waiting patiently for my return. I ran from the hotel without looking back, my footsteps echoing through the damaged corridors like gunshots. Outside, the October air felt shockingly cold against my skin, and I realized I had been sweating despite the autumn chill. My hands shook as I fumbled with my car keys, and I couldn't stop looking at my reflection in the driver's side window. It looked normal, tired, frightened, but undeniably my own. That night, I called Sarah. I told her everything I had seen, everything I had heard, everything that made no sense. She listened in silence, and when I finished, she was quiet for so long that I thought the connection had been lost. Finally, she told me about her own return visit to the hotel, which had happened 3 days earlier. She had seen the same impossible reflection, the same uniformed figures moving through pristine corridors. But in her experience, the staff member who had approached her reflection had been female, wearing a maid's uniform and carrying an armload of fresh towels. This other Sarah had accepted the towels with a smile and had begun walking deeper into the reflected hallway, moving toward rooms that existed only in the mirror's impossible geography. Sarah had left before seeing where her reflection went, but she had returned every day since. Each time, she said, her reflection moved a little further into that perfect hotel, accepting its role in a place that had burned decades before either of us was born. She spoke about the experience with a mixture of terror and longing that chilled me more than anything I had seen in the mirror. The next morning, Sarah didn't come to class. Her professors said she had submitted a formal request to change her thesis topic to the persistence of space in post-disaster architecture, focusing specifically on the Grandview Hotel. She had been granted special permission to conduct extended field research at the site, despite its condemned status and obvious safety hazards. I tried calling her, but her phone went straight to voicemail. I went to her apartment, but her roommate said she hadn't been home in days. Her car was still in the parking lot. Her mail was piling up in her box, but Sarah herself had simply vanished into her research. 3 days later, I drove back to the hotel one final time. I found her in the suite, standing before the mirror with her hand pressed flat against its surface. She didn't turn when I called her name, didn't respond when I grabbed her shoulder and tried to pull her away from the glass. Her skin was cold to the touch, and her breathing was so shallow that I had to hold my face close to hers to feel any air movement at all. In the mirror, Sarah's reflection stood in a luxury suite that gleamed with fresh paint and polished fixtures. She wore a hotel uniform, a crisp white shirt and dark skirt that looked like they had been tailored specifically for her. Her reflected face showed an expression of perfect contentment as she straightened already perfect pillows and adjusted flowers that would never wilt. Behind her reflection, other figures moved through the endless hallways of that impossible hotel. I recognized some of them, faces I had seen in old photographs that Sarah had found during her research. The 17 people who had been trapped during the fire, now serving as eternal staff in a place that existed only in reflection, only in the space between what was and what could never be. I tried to pull Sarah away from the mirror, but she was immovable, as if her feet had grown roots into the damaged floor. When I looked at my own reflection, I saw myself in the same dark uniform I had worn during my previous visit, that brass name tag catching the warm light as I moved through corridors that hummed with impossible life. The jingling of keys grew louder, and I knew that if I stayed much longer, if I pressed my hand against that warm glass one more time, I would join them in their perfect service. I would find my room ready and waiting, my duties clearly outlined, my place in that pristine hierarchy assured. I left Sarah standing before the mirror and drove directly to the police station. I told them I was concerned about a friend who had been spending too much time in a dangerous building, that she seemed to be having some kind of psychological episode. The officers were understanding but limited in what they could do without evidence of immediate danger. They promised to conduct a wellness check, to bring her in for evaluation if she seemed incapacitated or at risk. 2 hours later, they called to tell me they had found no one at the hotel. The building was empty, they said, just as it had been for decades. The suite I described showed evidence of recent visitors, footprints in the dust, some disturbed debris, but no person, no camping equipment, nothing to suggest anyone had been staying there. They had checked every room, every corridor, every space where someone might hide or become trapped. Sarah's car was still in her apartment parking lot. Her roommate still hadn't seen her. Her professors still expected her to submit her thesis research. But Sarah herself had vanished as completely as if she had never existed. I never went back to the hotel after that day. But sometimes when I catch my reflection in an unexpected surface, a storefront window, a turned-off computer screen, the side mirror of my car, I see something that makes me pause. A flicker of movement that doesn't match my own. A hint of warm light that has no source. The faint suggestion of burgundy carpet beneath my feet and crystal chandeliers above my head. And sometimes, late at night when the world is quiet and still, I hear the distant jingling of keys and know that somewhere in the space between what is and what was, the staff of the Grandview Hotel is still making their rounds, still tending to guests who checked in decades ago and found the service so exceptional that they never wanted to leave, still waiting, with infinite patience, for the rest of us to join them. Story 5. The night air cut through my jacket like ice water as I pedaled through the abandoned industrial district, my bike's headlight carving a thin wedge through the darkness. 3 a.m. was my favorite hunting hour, when the city slept and I could explore its forgotten corners without interruption. The old foundry district had been calling to me for weeks, a collection of worker housing that had been condemned but never demolished, standing like broken teeth against the skyline. I'd grown addicted to these nocturnal expeditions over the past year, ever since the insomnia started. The sleepless nights that began after the accident, though my therapist insisted I stop calling it that. Incident was her preferred term, as if softer language could somehow cushion the memory, But when you can't sleep, when every time you close your eyes you see twisted metal and hear screaming brakes, you find other ways to occupy the darkness. Urban exploration became my therapy. These empty places my sanctuary. The foundry smokestacks loomed above the row houses like monuments to industrial decay. Most of the structures sagged under the weight of neglect, their windows dark, empty sockets, doors hanging askew on rusted hinges. But there was something about the atmosphere tonight that felt different, thicker somehow, as if the air itself was holding its breath. I locked my bike to a no trespassing sign and pulled out my flashlight. The beam revealed graffiti-covered walls and debris-strewn porches, the usual archaeology of abandonment. A cat disappeared around a corner, its eyes reflecting green for an instant before vanishing. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heartbeat. The third house in the row caught my attention. Unlike its neighbors, this one maintained a certain dignity despite the decay. The front steps, while weathered, remained intact. The windows, though dark, weren't broken. Even the small garden in front showed signs of care. Weeds trimmed back, a path still visible through the overgrowth. The front door stood slightly ajar. I shouldn't have entered. Every instinct screamed against it, but curiosity has always been my weakness. The hinges protested with a low groan as I pushed inside, my flashlight revealing a surprisingly preserved interior. Wallpaper peeled in long strips like shed skin, but the floors remained solid beneath my feet. A staircase curved upward into darkness, its banister worn smooth by countless hands. The ground floor held the usual detritus of abandonment: overturned furniture, scattered papers yellowed with age, the musty smell of neglect. But as I climbed the stairs, something changed. The air grew warmer, carrying an unexpected fragrance, something floral and clean, like fresh laundry or evening primrose. The second-floor hallway stretched before me, doors standing open to reveal empty rooms, all except one. At the far end, a door remained closed, pale light seeping from beneath it like water under a dam. My footsteps echoed despite the carpet runner, each creak of the floorboards unnaturally loud in the silence. I pushed open the door and stepped into impossibility. The room was perfect. Not preserved, perfect. As if someone had just finished preparing it moments before my arrival. Cream-colored walls without a mark or stain, hardwood floors that gleamed in the warm light of an antique chandelier. The air smelled of beeswax and something savory, roasted chicken perhaps, or beef stew. But it was the dining table that stopped me cold, set for two, with china so delicate it seemed to glow in the lamplight. Crystal glasses caught the illumination and threw tiny rainbows across the tablecloth. Silver cutlery arranged with military precision. Steam rose from covered dishes, curling upward in lazy spirals that shouldn't have been possible in an abandoned house. My rational mind scrambled for explanations. Squatters, maybe. Someone using the house illegally. But everything was too pristine, too perfect. And there was no sign of habitation, no personal belongings, no makeshift furniture, no evidence of anyone living here. I stepped closer, drawn by a mixture of fascination and growing unease. The table setting was elegant, formal, the kind of arrangement you'd see in old movies about wealthy families. Each piece of silverware reflected my face in miniature, distorted and multiplied across the curved surfaces. Without thinking, I reached out and touched one of the spoons. The effect was instantaneous. Every window in the block slammed shut simultaneously, the sound echoing like gunshots across the empty neighborhood. The noise was impossible. Windows that had been broken for years, windows that couldn't possibly function, all moving in perfect synchronization. My heart hammered against my ribs as I spun toward the room's window, but heavy curtains had drawn themselves closed while I wasn't looking. Then the lights began. Candles flickered to life in the abandoned rooms around me, their glow visible through gaps in the curtains. Not just in this house, in all of them. The entire block awakened with warm, dancing illumination, as if every residence had suddenly become occupied by invisible tenants. I stumbled backward from the table, my breath coming in short gasps that misted in the suddenly frigid air. That's when I noticed it. The vapor from my breathing wasn't dispersing naturally. Instead, it hung in the air, coalescing into shapes. forming letters that spelled out words I didn't want to read. Sit. The message hung before my eyes for several heartbeats before dissolving. Another breath, another cloud of vapor, another command. Wait. My hands trembled as I backed toward the door but found it closed, though I distinctly remembered leaving it open. The knob wouldn't turn. The metal was so cold it burned my palm, but the mechanism refused to engage no matter how desperately I twisted. I was trapped. The dining room seemed to pulse around me, the walls breathing with an organic rhythm that made me question my own sanity. The chandelier's crystals chimed softly, though there was no wind to disturb them. The steam from the dishes continued rising, carrying scents that were simultaneously appetizing and nauseating. Welcome, spelled out my next exhalation. Our guest has arrived, came the next. Who's there? I called out, my voice cracking with strain. The words echoed strangely, as if the room was both smaller and larger than it appeared. No answer came, but I could feel something watching me. Not someone, something. A presence that pressed against my consciousness like fingers probing at the edges of my mind. I tried the window, fumbling with the curtains until I found the latch. But the glass wouldn't budge, sealed shut, as if it had been painted closed decades ago. Outside, the candle-lit windows of the other houses stared back at me like eyes, and I could swear I saw shapes moving within those rooms. Tall, thin figures that flitted past too quickly to focus on. The grandfather clock in the corner began to chime, though I could have sworn it hadn't been there when I entered. Midnight. But that was impossible. It had been after 3 when I arrived. Time seemed to have folded in on itself, becoming meaningless in this place that shouldn't exist. I returned to the table because there was nowhere else to go. The chair at the head pulled out by itself with a soft scraping sound, an invitation I was apparently expected to accept. My legs, weak with terror and disbelief, carried me forward against my will. The seat was warm, as if recently occupied. The covered dishes remained untouched, their contents hidden beneath silver domes that reflected my terrified face in infinite recursion. I could hear something moving beneath those covers, not the settling of cooling food, but something alive, something waiting. Dine with us, my breath commanded. Taste what we have prepared. The smell of the food intensified, becoming overpowering. My stomach cramped with sudden, violent hunger despite the fear that coursed through my veins. When had I last eaten? The memory seemed impossibly distant, as if it belonged to another person in another life. My hand reached for one of the serving domes without conscious direction. The silver was warm to the touch, pulsing like a heartbeat. I could feel something substantial beneath it, something that moved and shifted with purposeful intent. But as my fingers closed around the handle, doubt flooded my mind. Was any of this real? The medications I'd been prescribed since the accident, the ones I'd stopped taking weeks ago against my doctor's advice, they'd caused hallucinations before. Visual distortions, auditory phantoms, episodes where I couldn't distinguish between reality and chemical-induced fantasy. The accident, the word my therapist wanted me to avoid, echoed in my thoughts. Not an accident, a choice. The choice to close my eyes while driving, to surrender to the exhaustion and despair that had been building for months. The choice that nearly took my life and left me questioning every aspect of my perception. Was I even here? Was there really a table, a room, a house? Or was I lying somewhere else entirely? In a hospital bed, perhaps? Or on the side of a road where my bike had finally carried me too far into the darkness? The room shimmered around me like heat distortion, walls bending and flexing as if they were made of water rather than plaster. The candles in the distant windows flickered and danced, spelling out messages I couldn't quite decipher. The presence I'd felt watching me pressed closer, its attention focused with laser intensity on my trembling form. Choose, commanded the vapor from my lips. Stay or go, real or dream, guest or patient. The dining room began to rotate slowly around me, or perhaps I was spinning while it remained still. The covered dishes multiplied, stretching down the length of a table that now seemed to extend into infinity. Each dome pulsed with its own rhythm, a symphony of hidden heartbeats that synchronized with my own terrified pulse. I stood up so quickly the chair toppled backward, but there was no sound when it hit the floor. The silence was complete now, absolute. Even my own breathing made no noise, though I could still see the vapor-forming words in the frigid air. The door behind me clicked open. I spun around to find the hallway exactly as I'd left it, dark and empty and real. My flashlight lay on the floor where I'd apparently dropped it, its beam cutting through ordinary shadows. The stairs creaked under my weight as I fled, each step carrying me further from the impossible room and closer to what might be sanity. But as I reached the front door, I made the mistake of looking back. The light still glowed from the upstairs window, warm and inviting. And in that light, I could see a shadow moving around the dining table, tall and thin, methodically lifting each silver dome to reveal whatever delicacies waited beneath. As I watched, frozen by terror and fascination, the figure turned toward the window. It waved. I ran then, grabbing my bike and pedaling through the empty streets until my lungs burned and my legs ached. I didn't stop until I reached my apartment, didn't feel safe until I'd locked every door and window and checked them twice. But safety is a relative concept when you can't trust your own mind. As I sit here now, writing this account in the gray light of dawn, I find myself questioning everything. The taste of phantom food lingers on my tongue. The scent of beeswax and flowers clings to my clothes. And in the bathroom mirror, I can see a faint mark on my palm where I gripped that burning cold door handle. The medications sit on my kitchen counter, right where I left them 3 weeks ago. Tiny white pills that promise chemical equilibrium, that swear to regulate the broken neurotransmitters that might be responsible for everything I experienced. Or think I experienced. But here's what terrifies me most. I don't want to take them, because if what happened in that house was a hallucination, then the pills will take it away. And if it was real, if somewhere in this city there's a dining room where something waits patiently for its guest to return, then the pills won't help at all. The sun is rising now, painting my apartment in shades of gold and amber. Normal colors for a normal morning in a normal world, where abandoned houses stay abandoned and dead places remain dead. I should take the pills. I should call my therapist. I should accept that my mind is broken and that healing requires surrendering to uncertainty. But instead I find myself planning another ride, because somewhere in the back of my consciousness, in a place the medication can't quite reach, I can still feel that presence waiting. And despite every rational instinct screaming against it, I know I'm going to go back. After all, it would be terribly rude to leave a host waiting, wouldn't it? Story 6. The first time I heard them, I thought it was the wind. The Atlantic had been unusually restless that October, sending waves against the eroded foundation of the Blackwood estate, with the persistence of something trying to get in. I'd driven 3 hours from the university to reach this isolated stretch of Maine coast, where the Victorian mansion perched precariously on what remained of its original grounds. Half the gardens had long since surrendered to the advancing tide, leaving the house stranded like a ship run aground. I adjusted the strap of my equipment bag and studied the building through the October dusk. 3 stories of weathered shingles and ornate trim, windows dark as empty sockets. The real estate agent had warned me about the condition. No electricity, no running water, structural damage from decades of salt air and neglect. Perfect for my research into acoustic phenomena in abandoned structures. The iron key turned easily in the front door, as if the house were eager to welcome me inside. My footsteps echoed through the entry hall, each board beneath my feet announcing my presence with a groan of protest. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, and I caught the scent of brine mixed with something else, something organic and stale, like flowers left too long in water. The hallway stretched toward the back of the house, doors branching off to rooms I couldn't yet see clearly. I set up my base camp in what had once been the library, my equipment cases arranged on a table that had somehow survived the years of abandonment. The sensitive microphones, digital recorders, spectrum analyzers, thousands of dollars worth of gear designed to capture sounds at the very edge of human perception. I'd spent the last 5 years documenting the acoustic properties of empty buildings, measuring how architecture itself could create phantom voices, musical tones, and impossible echoes. The Blackwood estate had attracted my attention because of the stories. Local fishermen spoke of hearing singing from the empty house during certain nights, though none would specify exactly what they meant. The Historical Society had records of complaints dating back to the 1940s, when the last family members had finally abandoned the property. Always the same details. Voices in harmony, coming from inside the walls, heard only during the darkest hours. I spent the first night taking baseline recordings, mapping the building's natural acoustic signature. Every house has its own frequency, shaped by room dimensions, material density, and structural quirks. The Blackwood estate proved particularly resonant. My footsteps created cascading echoes that seemed to circle the rooms before fading. The wind outside generated overtones in the chimney that bordered on musical. By dawn, I had enough data to begin identifying which sounds belonged to the building and which might be anomalous. The second night brought the first full moon of my stay. I woke to the sound of water running through pipes. My eyes opened in the darkness of the library, where I'd arranged my sleeping bag between equipment cases. The sound was unmistakable, the rushing flow of water under pressure, moving through the walls around me. I checked my watch. 2:47 a.m. My flashlight beam found the nearest microphone array, and the LED display showed active recording with levels spiking well above the background threshold. But there was no water service to the house. The main line had been disconnected decades ago. I slipped into my shoes and followed the sound, moving carefully through the hallway with my handheld recorder. The flowing water seemed to move through the walls parallel to my path, as if following me. In the kitchen, I pressed my ear to the wall and heard the unmistakable gurgle of liquid in motion, accompanied by something else, a low humming that seemed to resonate through the plumbing itself. The humming grew clearer as I listened, not mechanical vibration, but human voices. Multiple voices, harmonizing in a way that reminded me of a church choir warming up before service. I adjusted my recorder's sensitivity and held it against the wall, watching the levels spike as the microphone picked up frequencies my ears could barely detect. Then the humming stopped. The silence that followed felt oppressive, as if the house were holding its breath. I waited for several minutes, recorder still running, but heard nothing except my own pulse and the distant crash of waves outside. When I finally returned to the library, I found all my equipment had somehow switched to standby mode, though I distinctly remembered leaving the system recording. I spent the following day analyzing the audio I'd captured. The water sounds were clear enough, though they made no physical sense given the building's plumbing situation. But the humming proved more elusive. When I isolated it from the background noise and played it back through my studio monitors, the voices became almost intelligible. Not quite words, but something that felt like language hovering just beyond comprehension. The third night, I positioned microphones throughout the house. Arrays in every major room, connected wirelessly to my main recording system. If the sounds returned, I would capture them from multiple angles, creating a three-dimensional map of their origin points. I settled into the library with my headphones on, monitoring all channels simultaneously. At exactly 2:47 a.m., the water started again. This time I could track its movement through the building. The sound began in the upper floors and flowed downward, following what must have been the original plumbing layout. But as I listened through my headphones, I realized the acoustic signature was wrong. Real water in pipes creates turbulence, pressure variations, and random noise. These sounds were too clean, too purposeful. And then the voices began. At first, just the humming I'd heard before, rising from the walls around me. But gradually, individual voices emerged from the chorus, each one distinct in timbre and pitch. They seemed to be singing without words, their harmonies weaving together in ways that made my skin crawl. The sound quality was impossibly clear, as if the singers were standing directly behind my microphones, rather than somehow embedded in the building's structure. I adjusted the monitoring software, trying to isolate individual voice tracks. The program's visual display showed waveforms that pulsed like heartbeats, and I noticed something that made my hands shake. The voices were responding to my movements. When I shifted in my chair, the harmony changed. When I reached for the controls, new voices joined the chorus, and then one of them said my name. Not sung, but spoken clearly in the brief pause between harmonic phrases. David. My own name, emerging from speakers connected to microphones positioned throughout an empty house. I yanked off my headphones and listened with my bare ears, but heard only silence. The recorded playback was worse. When I reviewed the night's recordings the next morning, I found my name repeated dozens of times, always spoken by different voices, sometimes whispered, sometimes called out as if trying to get my attention. But more disturbing was what else the voices seemed to know. They described my movements through the house with impossible accuracy. He's walking to the kitchen now. David is checking the recorder in the front room. Listen, he's breathing faster. I convinced myself it was some kind of elaborate hoax. Hidden speakers, perhaps, or neighbors playing an extended prank. I spent hours searching the building for concealed electronics, crawling through the basement and attic spaces with my flashlight. But the house's isolation made outside interference unlikely, and I found no evidence of modern equipment beyond my own. The fourth night, I tried to stay awake. I positioned myself in the central hallway, with a clear view of all my monitoring stations, determined to catch whatever was creating these impossible sounds. My caffeine intake had me jittery and hyper-alert, every shadow and dust mote registering as potential movement. The house seemed to press around me in the darkness, its familiar creaks and sighs taking on an expectant quality. 2:47 a.m. arrived with mechanical precision. The water sounds began exactly on schedule, but this time I was watching my equipment displays as they activated. Every microphone in the house registered the same impossible flowing liquid, but the sound had no visible source. It simply materialized in the walls, as if the building itself were generating the audio. The voices followed moments later, and I realized with growing horror that they could see me. David is sitting in the hallway, one voice reported in a conversational tone. He's wearing the blue jacket tonight. Another voice agreed. Yes, and he looks frightened. Poor David. They spoke about me with the familiarity of old friends, discussing my appearance and behavior as if I were a character in a story they'd been following for years. I stood up abruptly, and the chorus shifted to accommodate my movement. He's standing now, they noted with what sounded like approval. David wants to find us, don't you, David? The question seemed to hang in the air, waiting for an answer I didn't dare give. I grabbed my equipment and fled to the library, slamming the door behind me. But the voices followed, now speaking from the walls around me. We're here with you, David. We've been waiting so long for someone who could hear us properly. Their tone was gentle, almost caring, which made it infinitely worse than if they'd been threatening. Through my headphones, I could hear dozens of individual voices now, each one distinct, but all focused on me with unwavering attention. They described not just my current actions, but my thoughts, my fears, my growing certainty that I was losing my mind. He thinks he's going crazy, one voice observed sadly. David doesn't understand yet that we're trying to help him. Help him do what? The question formed in my mind, and immediately several voices answered. Listen, David. Really listen. We have so much to tell you. I ripped off my headphones and began shutting down my equipment, but the voices continued without electronic amplification. They spoke directly from the walls, the ceiling, the floorboards beneath my feet. The entire house had become a speaker system designed to deliver their messages, and there was no volume control. Don't leave us, David, they pleaded as I stuffed equipment into cases with shaking hands. You're the first one who could hear us clearly. The first one with the right equipment, the right ears. We've been so lonely. The drive back to the university blurred past in a haze of exhaustion and adrenaline. I kept the radio volume high to drown out any phantom voices that might follow me, though part of me knew that the sounds had never needed speakers or microphones to reach me. They had found some frequency that bypassed my equipment entirely, broadcasting directly into whatever part of my brain processed audio information. I spent the next 2 weeks analyzing the recordings, hoping that scientific scrutiny would reveal a rational explanation. But the data only raised more questions. The voices showed none of the acoustic properties of normal human speech. No breath sounds, no mouth noise, no natural harmonic distortion. They existed as pure audio information, somehow embedded in the building's structure during specific lunar phases. More troubling was the realization that the voices had known things about me that no outside observer could have discovered. They mentioned childhood memories, private fears, details about my research that I'd never spoken aloud. Either someone had conducted impossibly thorough surveillance of my entire life, or the voices had access to information that existed only in my own mind. The phone call came 3 weeks later, a representative from the Historical Society, asking about my research at the Blackwood estate. Apparently, other researchers had worked there over the years. Psychologists, paranormal investigators, and acoustic specialists like myself. Most had left after a few days, reporting equipment malfunctions and odd background noise. But a few had stayed longer, convinced they were on the verge of a breakthrough in understanding how buildings could generate apparently intelligent audio phenomena. Those researchers had never published their findings. According to the Historical Society's records, they'd simply disappeared from academic circles, leaving behind only cryptic notes about achieving perfect reception and joining the permanent chorus. I hang up the phone and sit in my university office, surrounded by the familiar hum of fluorescent lights and computer cooling fans. The sounds are harsh and artificial compared to the organic harmony I heard in the Blackwood estate. Sometimes, in the quiet moments between classes, I catch myself listening for something else, waiting for voices that know my name and speak with impossible knowledge about my daily activities. The recordings are still in my office, stored on encrypted drives that I haven't opened since returning from Maine. I tell myself they contain only audio artifacts and equipment malfunctions. But late at night, when the building is empty and the ventilation system creates its own subtle harmonies in the walls, I hear echoes of that otherworldly chorus. And sometimes, I think I hear them calling my name. The most disturbing possibility isn't that the voices were supernatural entities trapped in the Blackwood estate's plumbing. It's that they were exactly what they claimed to be. Researchers like myself, who had listened too long and too carefully, until the boundary between observer and observed dissolved entirely. Perhaps perfect acoustic reception comes with a price. The gradual realization that sound and consciousness might be more closely connected than modern science admits. I've submitted requests to return to the estate for follow-up research, but the Historical Society's board has denied each application. They claim the building is too structurally unsound for additional visits, though I suspect they have other reasons for keeping researchers away. The property remains empty, officially uninhabitable, legally inaccessible. But I've noticed something troubling about my recent equipment readings. Even here in my office, with all the ambient noise of a functioning university building, my most sensitive microphones occasionally register harmonies that don't match any identifiable source. Brief passages of collective humming, always just below the threshold of conscious hearing. And yesterday, during a particularly quiet moment while grading papers, I could have sworn I heard someone whisper my name from inside the wall behind my desk. I don't plan to investigate further. I've learned enough about acoustic phenomena to know when research crosses the line into dangerous territory. But sometimes, in the space between sleeping and waking, I find myself wondering what the voices might have revealed if I'd stayed longer. What knowledge they might have shared about the relationship between sound and consciousness, between the observer and the observed. The question follows me into my dreams, where I walk through empty corridors filled with impossible harmonies, searching for the source of voices that seem to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In these dreams, I always return to the Blackwood estate, drawn by the promise of perfect understanding. And in these dreams, I'm never alone. The chorus is always waiting. Story 7. The metallic taste of exhaustion coated my tongue as Marcus and I crested the final ridge of the forbidden trail. Sweat stung my eyes, blurring the landscape into watercolor smears of green and gray. The Serra do Mar stretched endlessly below us, its canopy undulating like a restless sea frozen in emerald. But what commanded our attention wasn't the breathtaking vista, it was the skeletal remains of machinery that shouldn't have existed here. Rusted towers pierced the sky like arthritic fingers, their steel bones stripped of flesh by decades of mountain weather. Cable car infrastructure, clearly abandoned, spread across the summit in a configuration that made no engineering sense. The main station house leaned precariously against a granite outcropping, its corrugated roof punctured by fallen branches. Most unsettling were the cables themselves, or rather, their absence. The support towers stood naked, their pulleys turning lazily in the mountain breeze with hollow musical chimes. "Jesus," Marcus whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "How long has this been here?" I approached the central tower, my boots crunching on a carpet of oxidized metal shavings. The structure towered 30 feet above us, its riveted joints weeping rust like dried blood. At its apex, the main pulley wheel continued its hypnotic rotation, squealing with each revolution. Something was wedged between the spokes, a dark rectangular object that caught the fading afternoon light. "There's something up there," I called to Marcus, who was examining what appeared to be a maintenance shed. The building's door hung askew, revealing nothing but shadows within. The climb up the maintenance ladder proved treacherous. Each rung threatened to crumble under my weight, showering me with flakes of corroded metal. The wind grew stronger as I ascended, carrying with it the acrid smell of ozone and something else. Something organic and unsettling that I couldn't identify. The object lodged in the pulley was a leather-bound journal, its covers warped by moisture and time. I carefully extracted it, noting how the binding had somehow remained intact despite years of exposure. The leather felt warm against my palm, pulsing almost imperceptibly like living tissue. Back on solid ground, Marcus and I huddled against the wind to examine our discovery. The journal's pages were filled with meticulous handwriting in faded blue ink. Most entries were dated from the 1960s, signed by someone identified only as Foreman Santos. But as I flipped through the pages, the dates became increasingly erratic, jumping decades at random before settling into a pattern that made my skin crawl. The most recent entries were dated for today. "Look at this," I told Marcus, pointing to an entry marked with our exact arrival time. The handwriting described our discovery of the site in uncomfortable detail, including Marcus's whispered profanity and my decision to climb the tower. But the description continued beyond our actual experience, chronicling events that hadn't yet occurred. Marcus read over my shoulder, his breathing growing shallow. "This is impossible. Someone's playing a sick joke." But I was already turning to the next entry, and the next. Each page detailed journeys taken in cabins that sail between clouds, describing destinations that defied geography. The foreman wrote of places beyond the valley where time moved differently, where the air itself seemed alive with consciousness. His tone grew increasingly frantic with each entry, though he never explicitly described what he encountered in these otherworldly locations. The final entry, dated for 8:47 p.m. today, still 3 hours in our future, contained only a single line. "They always return for those who read the words." A metallic screech echoed across the summit, sharp enough to make us both flinch. One of the empty pulleys had begun spinning faster, its bearings shrieking in protest. Then another joined it, and another, until the entire network of wheels was rotating in perfect synchronization. The sound built to a crescendo that seemed to resonate in my chest cavity, vibrating through my bones. Marcus grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my bicep. "We need to leave, now." But leaving wasn't an option anymore. As the mechanical symphony reached its peak, shapes began materializing in the spaces between the towers. Cable car cabins, their glass panels reflecting the dying sunlight, drifted through the air without any visible means of support. They moved with deliberate purpose, following invisible tracks that led directly toward our position. The lead cabin settled to the ground with a soft pneumatic hiss, its doors sliding open with the patience of a predator. The interior was illuminated by a phosphorescent glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. Fixed to the cabin's exterior was a metal placard, green with verdigris but still legible. It displayed today's date and a time, 8:27 p.m., exactly 20 minutes in our future. My legs felt disconnected from my body as I approached the cabin. The seats inside appeared to be original leather, remarkably well preserved despite the decades. The floor was carpeted in what looked like moss, soft and springy beneath my tentative steps. As my foot crossed the threshold, the phosphorescent glow intensified, and I could hear something that might have been breathing, or might have been the mountain wind filtering through hidden vents. Marcus remained frozen beside the tower, his face pale in the growing twilight. "Don't get in there," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. His eyes were fixed on a second cabin that had materialized nearby, its own placard displaying the same impossible timestamp. The journal in my hands grew warmer, its pages rustling as if turned by invisible fingers. When I looked down, new text was appearing on the previously blank final page, written in the same careful script as the earlier entries. The words formed slowly, each letter bleeding into existence like wounds. The choice was made when you climbed the tower. The choice was made when you read the words. Time is a circle here, and you have already chosen. A sound from inside the cabin made me look up. A soft clicking, like fingernails tapping against glass. But the interior appeared empty, just rows of seats facing windows that showed nothing but swirling mist. The clicking continued, rhythmic and patient, as if someone were keeping time to an unheard melody. "The foreman," I whispered, understanding flooding through me like ice water. "He's still here, still traveling." Marcus took a step toward his own cabin, his movements jerky and unnatural. "I can hear him," he said. "He's calling us." I wanted to run, to drag my brother away from this impossible place and race back down the mountain, but my body refused to obey. The journal's warmth was spreading up my arms, and with it came a terrible certainty. The entries I'd read weren't predictions. They were memories, experienced by countless others who had found this place and made the same inevitable choice. The cabin's interior lights began to pulse in a slow, hypnotic rhythm. With each pulse, the phosphorescent glow revealed new details. Scratches in the metal walls that looked disturbingly like claw marks, dark stains on the leather seats that could have been anything, and windows that occasionally showed glimpses of landscapes that belonged to no earthly geography. Marcus was already inside his cabin, though I couldn't remember seeing him move. He sat in the front seat, staring straight ahead with eyes that reflected the alien light. When he spoke, his voice sounded distant, as if it were traveling through water. "It's beautiful up here," he said. "You can see everything, past and future, all spread out like a map." The clicking sound grew louder, more insistent. Looking closer at my cabin's windows, I realized the sound wasn't coming from inside. It was coming from outside, from something moving through the mist that surrounded us. Shapes flitted past the glass, too quick to identify but unmistakably alive. They reminded me of the foreman's writings about consciousness in the air itself. My foot was already on the cabin's threshold when rational thought made one final desperate attempt to reassert itself. This was madness. Cable cars didn't float through empty air. Journals didn't write themselves. Whatever was happening here violated every law of physics and common sense. But as I tried to step backward, I felt resistance, as if the air behind me had thickened into an invisible wall. The placard's timestamp caught my eye again. 8:27 p.m. According to my watch, it was now 8:26. 1 minute. The journal's final page filled with text, the words appearing so rapidly that the ink seemed to smoke. Time is not a river flowing forward. Time is an ocean, and some places exist in the deep currents where past and future converge. You have been here before. You will be here again. The choice is an illusion. There is only the journey between clouds, beyond the valley where ordinary rules dissolve into mist. Marcus's cabin began to rise, lifting silently into the darkening sky. Through its windows I could see him still sitting motionless, his face serene. As the cabin ascended, it became translucent, then transparent, until only the faint outline remained visible against the stars. The clicking outside my cabin reached a crescendo, and suddenly I understood what I was hearing. It was the sound of time itself, the cosmic clockwork that governed reality, momentarily exposed in this place where the gears between moments were visible. The shapes moving through the mist weren't creatures. They were fragments of temporal machinery, the mechanisms that kept past and future properly separated. My watch read 8:27. The cabin doors began to close with mechanical inevitability. As the gap narrowed, I caught a glimpse of the journal's final words, written in handwriting I now recognized as my own. We are still here. We are still traveling. Between the clouds, beyond the valley, in the spaces where time forgets its own rules. The mountain remembers every soul who climbed to its summit. The mountain remembers and calls us back. The doors sealed with a soft hiss, and my cabin began its ascent into the impossible sky. Through the windows, I watched the ruins of the cable car station shrink below, already knowing that tomorrow another pair of hikers would find the forbidden trail. They would discover the journal, perhaps fallen from the pulley again, perhaps simply lying open on the station platform. They would read the entries dated for their arrival time. They would see the cabins materialize from empty air. They would face the same choice that wasn't really a choice at all. As we rose above the cloud line, I finally understood the foreman's writings. This wasn't transportation. It was transformation. A journey into the spaces between certainty and madness, where reality became negotiable. The cabins didn't take passengers to new places. They took them to new ways of existing, suspended forever in the 20 minutes between decision and consequence. Below us, the Serra do Mar spread out like a green circuit board, its patterns holding meanings that only became visible from this impossible height. And somewhere in that vast canopy, Marcus and I were still standing beside the rusted towers, reading the journal for the first time, convinced we were making a choice about whether to enter the waiting cabins. The clicking sound continued, patient and eternal, counting down to a moment that had already passed and would happen again tomorrow, and the day after, and every day until the mountain itself crumbled to dust. In the distance, I could see other cabins drifting through the star-filled darkness, their phosphorescent windows like fireflies against the void. Each one carried passengers who had made the same inevitable discovery, who had read the same impossible journal, who had stepped across the same threshold between the known and unknowable. We were all still choosing. We were all still traveling. Between clouds, beyond the valley, in the spaces where time forgot its own rules. Story 8. The headlights carved a pale tunnel through the fog as we drove along Highway 1, the Pacific Ocean somewhere beyond the gray wall that had descended without warning. Sarah had fallen asleep an hour ago, her breathing steady against the passenger window, and I was grateful for the silence. The radio had been crackling with static for the last 30 miles, fragments of old songs bleeding through like whispers from another decade. I should have taken the inland route. The thought came unbidden as I gripped the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles white against the black leather. We'd driven this coastal highway dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. The fog seemed to press against the windshield with an almost physical weight, and the familiar landmarks, the weathered billboards, the roadside diners, the scenic overlooks, had vanished into the gray void. My eyes burned from straining to see beyond the headlights' reach. The speedometer read 45, though it felt like we were crawling. Time stretched like taffy in the humid air that seemed to seep through the vents, despite the air conditioning running full blast. Sarah stirred occasionally, murmuring words I couldn't quite make out, her face peaceful in the dashboard's green glow. That's when I saw them. Two figures stood in the middle of the road about 50 yards ahead, their silhouettes materializing from the fog like apparitions. I eased my foot off the accelerator, squinting through the windshield. They weren't moving, just standing there in perfect stillness, blocking both lanes of the narrow highway. The brake pedal felt soft under my foot as I slowed to a crawl. The figures became clearer, a man and a woman, both unnaturally pale, dressed in formal attire that looked decades out of place. The man wore a dark suit with narrow lapels and a thin tie, while the woman was draped in a knee-length dress with a full skirt that hung motionless despite the coastal wind I could hear whistling outside. Their clothing looked pristine, as if they just stepped out of a 1960s cocktail party. I brought the car to a complete stop about 20 feet away from them. They faced us directly, their faces turned toward our headlights, but something was wrong with their eyes. They reflected the light like mirrors, creating twin pools of brightness where their pupils should have been. Neither of them blinked or acknowledged our presence beyond that unwavering stare. The radio crackled to life, startling me. Through the static came a sound that made my skin crawl. Voices, multiple voices, all whispering the same phrase over and over. Come back to the party, come back to the party, come back to the party. I reached for the radio knob, but my hand froze as the woman in the road took a single step forward. Her movement was unnatural, mechanical, like a marionette being pulled by invisible strings. The man remained motionless, but his head tilted slightly to one side with an audible crack that seemed to echo through the fog. Sarah remained asleep, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding just yards away. I wanted to wake her, to have someone else confirm what I was seeing, but something held me back. Perhaps it was the fear that if I took my eyes off the figures for even a second, they might move closer. Or perhaps it was the growing certainty that when Sarah opened her eyes, she would see only empty road. I pressed the horn. The sound was muffled and wrong, as if the fog were absorbing it before it could travel far. The figures didn't react. If anything, they seemed to become more solid, more present, as if the horn had somehow anchored them to this reality. My heart hammered against my ribs as I shifted into reverse, intending to back up and find another route. But as I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw that the fog had closed behind us like a curtain. The road we'd just traveled was gone, swallowed by an impenetrable wall of gray. The radio whispers grew louder, more urgent. Come back to the party. Please come back to the party. We've been waiting so long. I shifted back into drive and eased the car forward, angling toward the right shoulder to try to go around them. The tires crunched on gravel as I left the asphalt, but the shoulder was narrow, bordered by what looked like a steep drop into darkness. The ocean should have been there, but all I could see was an empty void that seemed to pull at my peripheral vision. As we drew alongside the figures, the woman turned her head to track our movement. The motion was too smooth, too fluid, like her neck was on a bearing. Her reflection eyes never left mine, and I could see my own face repeated infinitely in their depths, afraid, sweating, barely recognizing myself. The man remained facing forward, but his mouth opened in what might have been a smile. His teeth were too white, too perfect, and they seemed to glow with their own phosphorescent light. From between his lips came a sound like escaping air, or maybe distant laughter. Just as we passed them, the radio died completely. The sudden silence was somehow worse than the whispers. Sarah stirred but didn't wake, her hand falling limply into her lap. I pressed the accelerator harder, desperate to put distance between us and whatever those things were. That's when the streetlights began going out. I caught the first one in my rearview mirror. A tall sodium light that had been burning steadily suddenly flickered and died. Then the next one, and the next, each light extinguishing in perfect sequence, as if an invisible wave of darkness was following our car. The effect was hypnotic and terrifying, like watching dominoes fall in reverse. The darkness behind us was absolute, deeper than the fog, deeper than night. It seemed to swallow not just light but sound, creating a void that pulled at the edges of my consciousness. I found myself checking the rear-view mirror obsessively, watching the lights die one by one, each failure bringing the darkness closer to our rear bumper. Sarah's breathing changed, becoming shallow and rapid. She was dreaming, her eyes moving frantically beneath closed lids. Occasionally she would whisper something, words that sounded like names I didn't recognize, spoken in a voice that was almost but not quite her own. The dashboard began to flicker. At first I thought it was an electrical problem, but then I noticed the numbers. The speedometer was reading -35, though I could feel the car moving forward. The odometer was counting backward, subtracting miles we'd already traveled. Most disturbing of all, the fuel gauge was dropping below empty, into territory that shouldn't exist. I tried to make sense of what I was seeing, but rational thought felt slippery, hard to grasp. The fog outside seemed to be seeping into my mind. clouding my ability to process what was happening. Part of me wondered if I was having a stroke, or if carbon monoxide was somehow getting into the cabin. But the fear felt too real, too immediate to be a hallucination. The road curved left, following the coastline that I could no longer see. As we rounded the bend, I caught a glimpse of lights ahead. Not streetlights, but warmer illumination, like candles or oil lamps. They flickered through the fog with an inviting glow that made something deep in my chest ache with longing. Without conscious thought, I found myself slowing down, drawn toward the lights. They seemed to pulse with their own rhythm, and I realized after a moment that they were matching my heartbeat. The radio crackled back to life, but instead of the whispers, it now played big band music, the kind of swing jazz my grandfather used to listen to. The melody was hauntingly familiar, though I couldn't place it. The lights grew brighter as we approached, and I could make out shapes moving between them. Figures in formal wear, dancing and laughing, their movements graceful and synchronized like something from an old movie. They beckoned to us, their faces bright with joy and welcome. Sarah's eyes snapped open. She looked around in confusion, taking in the fog, the impossible dashboard readings, the warm lights ahead. But when she spoke, her voice was calm, almost dreamy. "We should join them," she said. "They look like they're having such a wonderful time." Her words sent ice through my veins. This wasn't Sarah, not the Sarah who hated parties, who preferred quiet evenings at home. This was someone else wearing her face, speaking with her voice but expressing thoughts that weren't her own. I jerked the steering wheel to the right, away from the lights, but the car barely responded. The power steering felt sluggish, as if we were driving through thick syrup. The engine RPMs climbed, but the speedometer continued to read negative numbers, and the fuel gauge had dropped so far below empty that the needle was pointing straight down. The dancing figures noticed our hesitation. Their movements became more urgent, more insistent. They waved harder, their smiles stretching too wide, their laughter rising above the music in a crescendo that made my teeth ache. Some of them began walking toward the road, their formal clothes flowing like liquid in the strange light. "Stop the car," Sarah said, her hand reaching for the door handle. "Let's go dance with them. Let's be happy." I pressed the accelerator to the floor, but the car seemed to move even slower. The fog swirled around us like water, and I had the horrible sensation that we were sinking, that the road beneath us was dissolving into something that wasn't quite solid anymore. The partygoers were at the road's edge now, reaching out with pale hands, their eyes reflecting the same mirror light as the figures we'd encountered earlier. The big band music swelled, and I could hear singing, dozens of voices harmonizing in a language I didn't recognize but somehow understood. They were singing about time, about going back, about fixing mistakes and undoing choices. Sarah's hand was on the door handle, pulling. The lock clicked. That's when I saw the speedometer hit -60, then -70. The odometer was spinning backwards so fast the numbers were blurring. The fuel gauge had disappeared entirely, leaving only an empty space where it should have been. The radio sang about eternal parties and endless dances, about a place where time moved differently and grief was just a distant memory. I reached across Sarah and grabbed the door handle, holding it closed as she struggled against me. She was stronger than she should have been, her movements sharp and violent in a way that was completely unlike her. When she turned to look at me, her eyes held that same mirror-light reflection. "Don't you want to be happy?" she asked, and her voice had layers now, harmonizing with itself like a chorus. "Don't you want to go back to when everything was perfect?" The question hit me like a physical blow because part of me did want that. Part of me wanted to give up, to let the car drift toward those welcoming lights and join the eternal celebration. The weight of disappointment, of compromises and small failures, of dreams deferred and love-grown routine, all of it could be left behind. But something deeper, some stubborn core of self-preservation, kept my foot on the accelerator. I closed my eyes and focused on moving forward, on the sensation of the tires against pavement, on the basic mechanical reality of the car's engine pushing us through space. When I opened my eyes again, We were alone on an empty road. The fog was lifting, revealing familiar landmarks in the pre-dawn darkness. The dashboard showed normal readings: positive speed, forward odometer, half a tank of gas. The radio played soft jazz, the kind of late-night programming Sarah actually enjoyed. She was asleep again, her breathing regular, her face peaceful. There was no sign that she had been awake at all. I drove in silence for the next hour, watching the fog retreat toward the ocean as the first hints of sunrise painted the eastern sky. By the time we reached our destination, I had almost convinced myself it had been a hallucination brought on by road fatigue and too much coffee. Almost. But sometimes when I'm driving alone at night and the radio catches a bit of static between stations, I hear it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of distant music and laughter, and voices calling out through the white noise. Come back to the party. Come back to the party. We're still waiting. And sometimes, just for a moment, I want to turn around and try to find my way back to that coastal highway. Sometimes I think about how easy it would be to get lost in the fog again, to let the car drift toward those welcoming lights where time moves backward and everything can be undone. But I keep driving forward, watching the speedometer climb and the odometer count up, accumulating miles and years and small compromises, moving inexorably toward whatever destination awaits us all. Because the alternative, that place where the party never ends and the dancing never stops, might not be heaven at all. It might be something else entirely, something that only looks like happiness from a distance, something that calls out to lonely travelers on dark roads and offers them exactly what they think they want. And that's the most terrifying possibility of all, that if I ever find my way back to that highway, I might discover that the choice to keep driving forward was never really mine to make. Story 9. The camera's shutter clicked one final time before the sun disappeared behind the Douro Hills, casting the abandoned quinta into shadows that seemed to breathe with the evening wind. I lowered my Canon and studied the image on the LCD screen. Ivy-covered walls, broken windows like dead eyes, and something else I hadn't noticed while framing the shot. A figure in one of the upper windows, or perhaps just a trick of light and leaf. My name is David Marsh, and I've spent the better part of 2 decades documenting forgotten vineyards across Europe for the International Wine Heritage Foundation. Portugal's Douro Valley was my latest assignment, a 3-week survey of abandoned quintas that once produced some of the world's finest port wines. Most were ruins now, their terraced slopes reclaimed by wild growth, their cellars empty of everything but memories and the persistent sweetness of fermented dreams. This particular quinta, Quinta da Sombra, according to my research, had been abandoned since the 1970s. Local records suggested it had been in the same family for over 3 centuries, before some unspecified tragedy forced them to abandon their ancestral home. The kind of mystery that made my academic heart race, even as something deeper, more primitive, whispered warnings I chose to ignore. The iron gate stood ajar, hanging from rusted hinges that screamed in protest as I pushed through. Weeds choked the cobblestone courtyard where carriages once unloaded their precious cargo. The main house loomed before me, its facade draped in ivy so thick it obscured architectural details, creating an organic shroud that rustled without wind. Evening mist began creeping up from the valley floor, carrying with it the phantom scent of fermentation. Impossible after so many years, yet unmistakable to my trained nose. I should have returned to my rental car then. Should have driven back to the Posada in Paso da Regua and reviewed my notes over dinner and a glass of the region's finest. Instead, I found myself drawn to the cellar entrance, a carved stone archway that yawned like a mouth frozen mid-scream. The wooden door hung open, revealing stone steps that descended into absolute darkness. My flashlight beam cut through the gloom, illuminating ancient stone walls stained dark with decades of wine aging. The air was thick and humid, pregnant with that same sweet scent that seemed to pulse with each breath I took. The cellar was vast, with vaulted ceilings that swallowed my flashlight beam. Dozens of massive oak barrels lined the walls, their iron hoops rusted but intact. They should have been empty, dry as bone after 40 years of abandonment. Yet as I moved between them, that cloying sweetness grew stronger, almost narcotic in its intensity. That's when I saw the vapor, thin wisps at first, barely visible in my flashlight beam, rising from the bung-holes of barrels that should have contained nothing but stale air. The vapor moved strangely, not dispersing as it should, but coiling and writhing as if guided by invisible hands. As the last daylight faded from the cellar entrance, these wisps began to take shape. I told myself it was pareidolia, the human tendency to see familiar patterns in random stimuli. The same phenomenon that makes us see faces in clouds or hear voices in white noise. But as I watched, the vapor formed increasingly distinct silhouettes. Couples locked in eternal waltz, their arms intertwined, their faces turned toward each other in expressions of longing so intense it made my chest ache. The temperature in the cellar dropped noticeably. My breath began to mist, joining the phantom dancers that spun and merged around me. I raised my camera, hands trembling not from cold but from something deeper, more primal. The flash fired, brilliant white light flooding the cellar for a split second. In that instant of illumination, the dancers were gone. But in the photograph displayed on my camera's screen, they remained. Dozens of translucent figures caught mid-dance, their features becoming clearer the longer I stared. Men in period dress, women in flowing gowns, all moving to music I couldn't hear, but somehow felt resonating in my bones. And in the background, barely visible but unmistakably present, more faces peering from the darkness between the barrels, faces that watched me with expressions of desperate hunger. I stumbled backward, my rational mind scrambling for explanations. Double exposure, perhaps, though I hadn't taken any previous shots in the cellar. Some kind of chemical reaction between old wine residue and humid air, creating hallucinogenic effects. Anything but the obvious conclusion that something impossible was happening in this forgotten place. The vapor dancers had vanished, but the sweet scent remained, now mixed with something else. The faint sound of music, distant and distorted, like a gramophone playing in another room. I followed the sound deeper into the cellar, past rows of empty bottles still racked as if waiting for a harvest that would never come. At the far end of the cellar, a narrow staircase led upward. The music grew clearer as I climbed, resolving into what sounded like a waltz from another century. The stairs deposited me in what must have been the main house's kitchen, though decades of neglect had reduced it to bare stone walls and broken fixtures. Moonlight filtered through grimy windows, casting everything in silver and shadow. The music was louder here, definitely coming from somewhere above. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I found another staircase and began climbing toward the upper floors. Each step creaked under my weight, the sound echoing through empty rooms like footsteps following behind me. The second floor had once been elegant, with high ceilings and tall windows that must have offered spectacular views of the Douro Valley. Now it was a maze of empty rooms, connected by a central hallway lined with doorways gaping like wounds. The music emanated from the far end of the hall, where another staircase led up to what I assumed was an attic. As I moved down the hallway, my flashlight beam caught something that made me freeze. Portraits lined the walls, family paintings in ornate frames, depicting generations of the Quinta's owners. But something was wrong with them, horribly wrong. Every face had been carefully scraped away, not damaged by time or vandalism, but methodically removed with what must have been painstaking precision. Bodies remained intact in period dress, hands positioned in formal poses, but where faces should have been, only blank patches of canvas stared back. The effect was deeply unsettling, as if the family's identity had been systematically erased from history. Between the portraits hung mirrors, dozens of them in various sizes and styles, their surfaces surprisingly clean despite the house's abandonment. I approached one cautiously, and my reflection appeared normal enough. But as I moved to the next mirror, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. In my peripheral vision, the mirrors reflected faces, not mine, others. When I looked directly at any mirror, I saw only my own pale, frightened expression. But when I looked away, caught glimpses from the corner of my eye, I could swear I saw other faces staring back, men and women in period dress, their expressions ranging from sorrow to desperate pleading. The music grew louder, more insistent. It was definitely coming from above, a melancholy waltz that seemed to tug at something deep in my chest. I found myself climbing the final staircase almost involuntarily, drawn by a compulsion I couldn't name or resist. The attic was a long, narrow space under the eaves of the house. Moonlight streamed through small windows at either end, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny spirits. The music was loudest here, though I still couldn't locate its source. It seemed to come from the very walls themselves, as if the house itself was humming. And there, arranged along one wall, I found them. A long dining table, set for perhaps 20 guests. Fine china plates, crystal glasses, silver cutlery, all covered in decades of dust, but arranged with meticulous care. The glasses caught the moonlight, creating tiny prisms that scattered rainbow fragments across the table's surface. But that wasn't the strangest part. As I watched, the glasses began to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly. They slid across the dusty tablecloth with no visible force propelling them, rearranging themselves, aligning in new patterns, as if invisible hands were preparing for an eternal feast. The sound they made was barely audible, a soft whisper of crystal against fabric that harmonized eerily with the phantom waltz still playing in the background. I approached the table with trembling steps, my flashlight beam dancing across the moving glassware. One glass, a beautiful cut crystal piece that caught and fractured the light, slid to the table's head, directly in front of where I stood. Others arranged themselves in precise order down both sides, as if preparing for guests who would never arrive. Or perhaps guests who were already here. The temperature in the attic plummeted. My breath came in sharp puffs that hung in the air longer than they should have. And in those brief clouds of vapor, I glimpsed faces again. Dozens of them, all turned toward me with expressions of desperate hope. That's when I tried to leave. The attic stairs that had brought me up were gone. Not blocked or collapsed, simply absent, as if they had never existed. Where the stairwell should have been was nothing but solid wall, the wood grain continuous and undisturbed. I ran to the windows at either end of the attic, but they were sealed shut, the glass thick and unyielding no matter how hard I pounded against it. Panic clawed at my throat as I searched frantically for another exit, but the attic was a sealed box, and I was trapped inside with a table set for ghosts and glasses that moved of their own accord. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time seemed elastic in that place. I sat heavily in the chair at the table's head, my mind cycling through increasingly desperate explanations. A psychotic break brought on by stress and isolation. Carbon monoxide poisoning from some unknown source. An elaborate hoax, though I couldn't imagine who would orchestrate such a thing or how. The music never stopped. The glasses continued their slow dance across the table's surface, occasionally pausing in new configurations before resuming their patient rearrangement. And always, in my peripheral vision, I caught glimpses of faces in the dust motes, in the moonlight patterns on the walls, in my own exhausted reflection in the crystal glasses. As dawn approached, I could see the first hints of gray light through the sealed windows. The table setting was complete. 20 glasses arranged in perfect symmetry, as if waiting for a toast that would mark the beginning of some cosmic celebration. All empty, all gleaming with their own internal light, all focused on me with an expectation so intense it was almost audible. I understood then, with the clarity that comes from complete exhaustion and terror, what was expected of me. The phantom dancers in the cellar, the faceless portraits, the mirrors that reflected the past, they were all waiting. Had been waiting for decades for someone to complete the ritual, to raise a glass in acknowledgement of their eternal feast. But there was no wine. I laughed then, a sound so broken and desperate that it seemed to silence even the phantom music. They wanted me to toast with empty glasses, to drink from vessels that contained nothing but air and longing. It was absurd, impossible, meaningless. Yet as I sat there in the growing light, surrounded by the patient arrangement of crystal and shadows, I began to understand that meaning itself was irrelevant. The Quinta wanted what it wanted, and I was merely the latest in what might have been a long line of visitors who had stumbled into this pocket of suspended time. I reached for the glass in front of me with shaking hands. It was warm to the touch, despite the freezing air, and seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. The crystal was flawless, but as I lifted it, I could swear I saw liquid swirling inside, dark as blood, sweet as forbidden fruit, old as the earth itself. The other glasses around the table began to rise on their own, hovering a few inches above the dusty cloth. Invisible hands seemed to grasp them, invisible lips pressed against their rims. The phantom music swelled to a crescendo that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. I raised my glass higher, and 20 ghostly toasts met mine in the air. The sound of crystal touching crystal rang out like church bells, filling the attic with harmonics that seemed to come from another world entirely. To the harvest that never ends, I heard myself say, though I had no memory of deciding to speak. The wine that wasn't there tasted like memory and regret, like love and loss fermented together in the darkness of human experience. It burned going down, though my glass remained empty to my eyes, and I felt something fundamental shift inside me, some barrier between the possible and impossible dissolving like sugar in warm liquid. When I lowered the glass, the attic was empty. No table, no chairs, no phantom orchestra playing their eternal waltz. Just an empty space under the eaves, filled with morning light and the ordinary dust of abandonment. The stairs were back. I descended through the house in a daze, past the mirrors that now reflected only me, past the portraits whose faces had somehow returned, though whether they had always been there or had materialized during my night in the attic, I couldn't say. The cellar was silent, its barrels dry and empty, no trace of the vapor dancers who had welcomed me to their world. I drove back to the Posada, in a state of shock that lasted for days. The photographs I had taken showed nothing unusual, just an abandoned quinta, empty rooms, and the normal detritus of a place forgotten by time. No dancers, no faces in mirrors, no impossible arrangements of glassware. But sometimes, late at night when I'm reviewing my wine collection in my own cellar in California, I catch the scent of something impossibly sweet on the air. And sometimes, when I raise a glass of particularly fine vintage to the light, I swear I can see other hands raising glasses alongside mine, other voices joining in toasts to harvests both real and imagined. I never returned to Portugal, never finished my survey of the Douro Valley's abandoned quintas. The Foundation accepted my resignation without question, perhaps sensing something in my manner that discouraged too many inquiries. But I kept the address of Quinta de Sombra, written in my own hand on a scrap of paper that I carry in my wallet. Sometimes I take it out and study the words, wondering if I dreamed the entire experience or if something more fundamental happened in that place where time seemed to bend and reality became negotiable. The truth, I've come to realize, is irrelevant. What matters is the taste that lingers, sweet and complex, with notes of longing and an aftertaste of eternity. The vintage of experiences that can't be bottled, stored, or shared, but only remembered in the quiet moments when the boundary between the real and impossible grows thin as vintage wine. And sometimes in those moments, I find myself raising my glass to empty air, offering a toast to friends I may never have met in a place that may never have existed, drinking wine that exists only in the space between heartbeats, where all harvests are eternal, and all guests are welcome at the table that memory sets. The glass is always empty. The glass is always full. Both things are true, in the place where wine becomes dream, and dream becomes the only reality that matters. Story 10. The GPS died 3 miles back, but I kept driving. Had to. The delivery app promised double pay for overnight routes to rural communities, and my rent wasn't going to negotiate itself. The headlights carved through darkness so thick it seemed to swallow the beams whole, revealing nothing but endless rows of corn that whispered secrets in a language I didn't want to understand. Promise City appeared like a hallucination. One moment, I was surrounded by agricultural emptiness. The next, warm yellow light spilled from windows arranged in perfect suburban rows. The transition felt wrong, too sudden, too clean. No outskirts, no gradual buildup of civilization. Just darkness, then light, as if someone had flipped a switch on an entire world. I pulled the van to the curb and checked my phone. No signal. The delivery manifest listed 12 addresses, all standard grocery orders, milk, bread, the usual late-night necessities. Nothing strange about the request itself, but something about this place made my skin crawl before I'd even killed the engine. Every house glowed with the same butter-colored warmth. Porch lights blazed, windows revealed glimpses of furnished rooms, yet the streets lay empty as a graveyard. No cars in driveways, no movement behind those illuminated windows. Just light without life, like a movie set after the cameras stopped rolling. I grabbed the first delivery bag and approached the nearest house, 1247 Covenant Street, according to my manifest. Mrs. Henderson had ordered 2 gallons of milk and a loaf of whole wheat bread. Simple enough. The porch creaked under my weight, each board announcing my presence to an audience I couldn't see but somehow felt watching. I knocked 3 times, waited, knocked again. The sound echoed strangely, as if the house were empty despite the lights burning in every room. No answer. I knocked harder, calling out that I had a delivery. My voice sounded foreign in the stillness, too loud and somehow muffled at the same time. Still nothing. That's when I noticed the jug. It sat beside the door, ceramic white with steam rising from its mouth like incense. My name, Derek, was scrawled across its surface in fresh chalk, the letters slightly uneven as if written by an unsteady hand. The milk inside looked fresh, still warm, impossible. I hadn't brought any ceramic jugs. My deliveries came in plastic containers, clearly labeled with the grocery chain's logo. This looked homemade, handcrafted, like something from another century. I left Mrs. Henderson's order by the door and backed away, my skin prickling with the certainty that eyes followed my movement from those bright windows. But when I looked directly at them, I saw only empty rooms and drawn curtains that swayed without any breeze. The second house yielded the same result. No answer to my knocking, and another steaming jug waiting by the door. This one bore my name in the same chalky scrawl, the ceramic warm to the touch when I accidentally brushed against it. The steam carried a smell I couldn't identify, sweet but somehow wrong, like flowers left too long in standing water. House after house, the pattern repeated. Blazing lights, locked doors, no responses to my increasingly desperate knocking. And always, the jugs. 12 of them now, one at each address on my list, each one steaming despite the cool night air, each one marked with my name in that childish chalk scrawl. My hands began to shake as I approached the final house. This couldn't be real. Someone was playing an elaborate prank, though I couldn't imagine who or why. Maybe the grocery store had set this up as some kind of bizarre team-building exercise. Maybe I was having a breakdown. Maybe I'd never left the city at all and was hallucinating in my van in some parking lot. But the cement felt real under my feet. The weight of the delivery bags felt real in my hands. And the steaming jugs felt unnaturally, impossibly real when the night breeze carried their strange sweet scent directly to my nostrils. At the last house, I didn't even bother knocking. The jug waited by the door like all the others, patient and expectant. I set down the final delivery and stepped back, my pulse hammering in my ears. That's when I heard the singing. It drifted from somewhere deeper in the village, a chorus of voices raised in harmony that wasn't quite harmony. The melody wandered, lost and searching, with no words I could distinguish. Just voices weaving together in a pattern that hurt to follow, like trying to solve a puzzle with pieces that didn't belong to the same picture. I followed the sound because I didn't know what else to do. My van felt impossibly far away, though I'd only walked a few blocks. The singing grew louder as I traced a path marked by small stones scattered across the pavement. Not random, but deliberately placed, leading me toward the village center like breadcrumbs in a fairy tale that had taken a wrong turn. The community center squatted at the end of Covenant Street like a toad made of brick and mortar. Light poured from its windows, and the singing spilled out with it, that wordless hymn that seemed to wrap around my skull and squeeze. The front doors stood wide open, revealing glimpses of movement inside. I climbed the steps on legs that felt borrowed from someone else's body. The singing stopped the moment my foot touched the threshold. Inside, 30 or 40 people stood arranged in neat rows, their backs to me, facing a simple wooden cross mounted on the far wall. They wore ordinary clothes, jeans, sweaters, the kind of casual attire you'd see at any small-town gathering. But they stood too still, too perfectly aligned, like mannequins positioned by an obsessive window dresser. None of them turned around, though I was certain they knew I was there. The silence stretched until my ears rang with it, louder than the singing had been. I wanted to speak, to announce myself, to ask what the hell was going on, but my throat had closed up tight as a fist. Then they began to sing again, still without turning, still without words. The melody twisted through the air like smoke, beautiful and wrong in equal measure. I found myself swaying slightly, my mind growing fuzzy around the edges. The hymn seemed to be calling to something inside me, something I'd forgotten I possessed. One of the singers turned her head, just her head, her body remaining perfectly aligned with the others. Her face was kind, grandmotherly, with wire-rimmed glasses and gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She smiled at me with genuine warmth, and when she spoke, her voice carried clearly over the continuing chorus. She told me I needed to return what I'd taken, each jug to its proper place, exactly where I'd found it. Only then could I leave Promise City. Only then would the path home become clear. I tried to tell her I hadn't taken anything, hadn't touched a single jug. But she'd already turned back to face the cross, and the singing swelled to fill the space my words might have occupied. I stumbled back outside, my head spinning with that impossible melody. The night air felt thick as soup, and every breath required conscious effort. The village light seemed brighter now, harsh and accusing. Those 12 jugs waited for me, patient as graves, each one a white ceramic accusation in the darkness. The rational part of my mind insisted this was impossible. I was a delivery driver, not a thief. I'd never seen these jugs before tonight, had never taken anything from this place. But rationality felt thin and fragile here, like ice forming over deep water. I returned to the first house and picked up the jug with trembling hands. It was heavier than it looked, filled with milk that sloshed gently against the ceramic walls. The warmth seeped through to my palms, uncomfortably intimate, like holding something alive. The door to 1247 Covenant Street stood open now, though I was certain it had been locked before. Warm light spilled from the threshold, revealing a spotless kitchen beyond. I carried the jug inside, my footsteps echoing in the empty space. The refrigerator hummed quietly in the corner, its door slightly ajar. I opened it fully and found a space waiting. Exactly the right size, as if it had been custom-made for this particular jug. The milk fit perfectly on the middle shelf, settling into its designated spot with a soft clink. When I turned around, the front door had closed. I tried the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Panic fluttered in my chest like a trapped bird. I pushed harder, threw my shoulder against the wood, but the door might as well have been welded shut. The windows showed only darkness now, though I could swear the streetlights had been burning moments before. Then I heard the sound of liquid being poured. I spun toward the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs. The jug sat exactly where I'd placed it, but it was empty now. Completely, impossibly empty. A trail of white drops led from the refrigerator to the sink, where milk disappeared down the drain with soft, gulping sounds. The front door opened easily when I tried it again. I ran to the second house, grabbed the next jug, and repeated the process. Each time, the door opened for me. Each time I found the perfect space waiting. Each time the milk drained away while my back was turned, leaving the ceramic empty and somehow satisfied. By the seventh house, my mind had started to fracture around the edges. The village felt different now, older, as if the suburban facade was peeling away to reveal something much more ancient underneath. The streetlights flickered in patterns that almost formed words. The corn in the surrounding fields rustled with movement that had nothing to do with wind. The singing started again as I approached the 11th house. that wordless hymn drifting from the community center. But now I could almost understand it, could almost grasp the meaning hidden in those wandering melodies. It spoke of promises kept and debts paid, of rituals that demanded completion, and circles that required closing. The final jug felt different in my hands, heavier, more substantial, as if it contained something denser than milk. When I lifted it, the liquid inside moved strangely, too thick, too slow. I didn't want to look inside, didn't want to see what I'd been carrying all along. The last house's door opened before I reached it. The kitchen beyond was identical to all the others, but something about the refrigerator made my skin crawl. When I opened it, the shelves were full. 11 ceramic jugs arranged in perfect rows, all empty, all waiting for their 12th companion. I placed the final jug in its designated spot and stepped back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, all 12 jugs began to glow with soft white light, and the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees in an instant. The milk didn't drain this time. Instead, it began to bubble and foam, spilling over the edges of all 12 jugs simultaneously. The liquid hit the refrigerator shelves with sounds like whispered conversations, flowing in streams that defied gravity, moving upward along the walls, across the ceiling, forming patterns that hurt to look at directly. I turned and ran. The front door slammed behind me with the finality of a coffin lid. The village street stretched before me, but it looked different now. Longer, narrower, as if the houses were pressing closer together. My van sat exactly where I'd left it, but it seemed miles away. I ran anyway, my footsteps echoing off empty windows. Behind me, the singing swelled to a crescendo, no longer wordless but forming syllables in a language that predated human speech. The streetlights began to dim one by one, darkness chasing me like a living thing. I reached the van and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so violently I could barely fit them in the ignition. The engine turned over on the third try, and I floored the accelerator without looking back. The headlights carved through corn rows that seemed to lean inward, reaching for the van with green fingers. I drove for what felt like hours, the speedometer climbing past safe speeds, past sane speeds, anything to put distance between myself and Promise City. When I finally stopped shaking enough to check my phone, I was in a gas station parking lot 3 states away. The delivery app showed no record of any overnight route to Promise City. My GPS had no record of the trip. According to every digital trace of my existence, I'd never left my apartment that night. But my van reeked of that sweet, wrong smell. And when I checked the cargo area, I found 12 ceramic jugs nestled in the corner, each one empty, each one warm to the touch. My name was written on every one in fresh chalk. I threw them away in a dumpster behind the gas station and drove home as the sun rose over highways that looked exactly like they should. Everything was normal, rational, explainable. I told myself it had been a stress-induced hallucination, a breakdown brought on by too many late-night shifts and too much coffee. That was 3 months ago. Last night, I found a ceramic jug by my apartment door, empty, warm, with my name written in chalk across its white surface. The grocery delivery app is showing a new overnight route, a village called New Covenant, isolated among wheat fields 200 miles north. The pay is triple this time. I'm loading the van now. The jug fits perfectly in the cargo area, right next to 11 others that appeared while I was sleeping. They're all empty, all warm, all marked with my name in that same unsteady scrawl. I know I should throw them away, should delete the app, should find a new job in a different city, but my hands are already turning the ignition, and my GPS is plotting a route to coordinates that don't exist on any map. The corn is calling, the milk is waiting, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, 30 or 40 voices are practicing their wordless hymns, preparing for my return. Story 11. The rusted gate screamed against its hinges as Marcus pushed it open, the sound cutting through the October night like a medical saw through bone. Behind me, Elena and Jake shifted nervously, their flashlight beams dancing across the crumbling facade of Riverside Sanatorium. Condemned notices fluttered from every surface like prayer flags for the forgotten. Last chance to back out, I whispered, though my voice carried further than intended in the hollow space between the buildings. The demolition crew would arrive Monday morning, and with them, any chance of salvaging the vintage medical equipment rumored to be inside would disappear under tons of steel and concrete. Elena adjusted her backpack, heavy with the empty cases we'd brought for specimen jars and antique instruments. Jake's breathing had already taken on that shallow quality it got when his anxiety spiked, but he nodded toward the main entrance. The heavy wooden doors stood slightly ajar, as if the building itself was inviting us in. The lobby stretched before us like the inside of a throat, all burgundy wallpaper and tarnished brass fixtures. Our footsteps echoed strangely, not quite the sharp tap of shoes on marble, but something softer, more organic. The air tasted of antiseptic and something else, something sweet and cloying that reminded me of overripe fruit. "Jesus, it's warm in here," Jake muttered, pulling at his collar. He was right. Despite the October chill outside, the building felt heated, almost feverish. The radiators hadn't worked in decades, yet warmth seemed to pulse from the walls themselves. Elena had already moved toward the reception desk, her light illuminating rows of filing cabinets behind a metal partition. The gaps between the cabinet drawers were wider than they should have been, as if the metal itself had expanded in the heat. When she tried the first drawer, it slid open with surprising ease, revealing manila folders arranged with military precision. "These look recent," she said, holding up a file. Her voice carried a note of confusion that made my stomach tighten. The folder bore the sanatorium's letterhead, but the paper was crisp, unblemished by age or moisture. I took the file from her hands, and the moment my fingers touched the paper, a strange sensation ran up my arms. Not quite static electricity, but something warmer, more intimate. The patient information form inside was filled out in neat clinical handwriting. The name at the top made my throat constrict. Marcus Chen. My name. My full name, including the middle initial I rarely used. The date of admission was November 15th, 2024, 3 weeks from now. "What's it say?" Jake asked, moving closer. His flashlight beam wavered, and I realized his hands were shaking. I scanned the diagnosis section, my eyes struggling to focus on the words. The handwriting seemed to shift slightly, as if the ink was still wet. Acute stress reaction following psychotic episode. Patient exhibits paranoid delusions, auditory hallucinations, and dissociative behavior. Recommend immediate psychiatric evaluation. "It's probably just an old template," I said, though my voice sounded unconvincing even to myself. I set the file aside and reached for another. This one bore Elena's name, dated December 3rd, 2024. The diagnosis was similar but more specific: substance-induced psychosis, likely triggered by prolonged exposure to environmental toxins. Patient reports seeing things that aren't there and hearing voices in inanimate objects. Elena grabbed the file from my hands, her face pale in the flashlight's glow. "This is impossible. This has to be some kind of joke." But Jake had already opened a third file, his own. His breathing became even more labored as he read, and when he looked up, his eyes had taken on a glassy quality I'd never seen before. "It says I have a panic disorder with agoraphobic tendencies. Progressive deterioration following exposure to..." He paused, squinting at the handwriting. "Following exposure to anomalous acoustic phenomena." A door slammed somewhere deeper in the building, the sound reverberating through the corridors like a gunshot. We all froze, listening for footsteps or voices, but there was only silence and the faint whisper of air moving through forgotten vents. "We should check the equipment rooms," I said, partly to break the tension, and partly because staying in one place felt suddenly unbearable. The files were coincidences. They had to be. Someone's idea of a prank, or perhaps training materials with randomly generated names that happened to match ours. We moved deeper into the building, following signs toward the medical wing. The corridors narrowed as we progressed, and the wallpaper gave way to painted cinder blocks that seemed to absorb our flashlight beams rather than reflect them. The air grew thicker, more oppressive, and I found myself breathing through my mouth to avoid the increasingly strong medicinal smell. "Do you hear that?" Elena asked, stopping abruptly. We all listened, straining against the silence. There was something, a faint rhythmic sound, like distant drumming, but too regular to be mechanical. Jake pulled out the vintage stethoscope he'd brought from his grandfather's medical bag, one of the items we'd hoped to replace with something even older. Almost absently, he pressed the chest piece against the nearest wall, and his face immediately went white. "What is it?" I asked, but he just held up a hand for silence, his eyes wide with concentration. After a long moment, he pulled the stethoscope away and offered it to me with trembling fingers. "Listen," he said simply. I pressed the cold metal to the wall and immediately understood his reaction. The sound was unmistakable. A heartbeat, strong and steady, coming from somewhere within the plaster and brick. Not the faint echo of my own pulse, which I sometimes heard in medical equipment, but something external, something that seemed to originate from the building's structure itself. Elena took her turn, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and growing fear. "It's synchronized," she whispered. "It's beating at exactly the same rate as mine." I pressed my fingers to my wrist, counting my pulse against the rhythm coming through the stethoscope. She was right. The heartbeat in the wall matched my own accelerated rate perfectly, as if the building was somehow monitoring our vital signs. "We need to find the equipment and get out," I said, though my voice carried less conviction than before. The corridors ahead seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the steel doors that lined the hallway stood at odd angles, as if the building's foundation had shifted. As we approached the next intersection, one of those doors suddenly slammed shut with tremendous force, the sound exploding through the narrow space like a cannon blast. But that wasn't the strangest part. The strangest part was how the metal seemed to bulge outward afterward, as if something massive had thrown itself against the other side. "Did you see that?" Jake asked, his voice cracking slightly. The door continued to strain against its frame, the steel creaking and warping in ways that metal shouldn't be able to move. Another door slammed, this one behind us, cutting off our retreat. Then another and another, creating a cascade of metallic thunder that seemed to drive us forward toward sections of the building that weren't on any floor plan we'd studied. Elena's flashlight caught a sign pointing toward the patient wards, but the arrow seemed to point in a direction that didn't match the corridor's layout. When I looked again, the sign appeared normal, but my sense of spatial orientation had become completely unreliable. "The walls are warm," Elena said, touching her palm to the painted surface. She was right. The cinder blocks radiated heat like a fever, and when I listened carefully, I could hear that rhythmic drumming again, coming from all around us now. Jake used the stethoscope compulsively, pressing it against wall after wall. Each time his eyes grew wider, his breathing more labored. "They're all different," he said. "Every wall has a different heartbeat. It's like the whole building is alive." I wanted to tell him he was being ridiculous, that old buildings made all kinds of sounds, that our imaginations were running away with us. But when I took the stethoscope and listened for myself, I couldn't deny what I heard. Not just heartbeats, but breathing. The slow, deep respirations of something enormous, something that encompassed the entire structure. The corridor ahead branched in directions that definitely hadn't been there when we'd entered. The building seemed to be rearranging itself around us, creating new pathways while sealing off others. The steel doors continued their rhythmic slamming, always just out of sight around the next corner, always driving us deeper into areas that felt increasingly unfamiliar. Elena stopped in front of another filing cabinet, this one standing inexplicably in the middle of the hallway. The drawers were labeled with dates, all future dates, extending years into the time ahead. She opened one at random and pulled out another set of files. "These are all about us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Every file in here, different dates, different diagnoses, but all about us." I took one of the folders, dated 6 months from now. My diagnosis had evolved: chronic delusional disorder with paranoid features. Patient insists that medical building displayed premonitory awareness. Recommend long-term institutional care. Jake's file for the same period was even more disturbing. catatonic stupor following severe psychological trauma. Patient remains unresponsive to external stimuli. Cause unknown. This isn't real, Elena said, but she was reading her own file as she spoke, and her face suggested that whatever she was seeing contradicted her words. This can't be real. I wanted to agree with her, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. The building knew us. Somehow, impossibly, it had been expecting us. The files weren't predictions, they were reports, detailed medical assessments of our psychological states in response to what was happening to us right now. Another door slammed, closer this time, and the sound seemed to originate from inside the walls themselves rather than from any actual door. The heartbeats had grown louder, more insistent, and I realized with growing horror that they were no longer synchronized with our own pulses. They were accelerating, becoming erratic, as if whatever was producing them was experiencing cardiac distress. Jake pressed the stethoscope to his own chest, then immediately to the wall beside him. "It's dying," he said, his voice hollow with shock. "Whatever's in there, it's dying, and it's taking us with it." The corridor began to narrow, the walls closing in with almost imperceptible slowness. What had been wide enough for 3 people walking abreast was now forcing us into single file. The ceiling seemed lower too, though when I looked directly at it, it appeared unchanged. Elena grabbed my arm, her fingers digging into my jacket. "We have to get out, now." But when we turned back toward the way we'd come, the corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, lined with doors that all looked identical and all seemed to pulse with that same organic rhythm. The exit signs pointed in impossible directions, up toward the ceiling, down toward the floor, into walls that showed no trace of openings. I pulled out my phone to check the time and found that the display showed dates months in the future. Elena's phone was the same, and Jake's had stopped working entirely, its screen black and cold despite being fully charged when we'd entered. "Look at this," Elena said, pointing to another file cabinet that had somehow appeared directly in front of us. This one was different, newer, with digital displays where the old ones had paper labels. The glowing readouts showed our names, but the dates were changing in real time, scrolling forward through weeks and months and years. I watched my own file update itself, new diagnoses appearing and disappearing like a medical slot machine. Acute paranoid episode, dissociative fugue state, institutional commitment recommended, patient deceased, cardiac arrest secondary to psychological trauma. That last entry flickered and vanished, replaced by others, all equally disturbing. But the pattern was clear. The further into the future the files projected, the worse our conditions became, until they all ended the same way. "It's not predicting anything," I said, the realization hitting me with sickening clarity. "It's creating it. The building is documenting what it's doing to us." Jake laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "You're talking about a building like it's alive. Listen to yourself. We're having a group psychotic break, probably from mold exposure or carbon monoxide or something." But even as he spoke, he continued using the stethoscope, pressing it compulsively against every surface within reach. The sounds he reported grew increasingly disturbing. Not just heartbeats now, but voices, whispers, conversations in languages he couldn't identify. The walls around us had taken on an organic quality, their surfaces slightly curved and yielding to the touch. The paint had a skin-like texture, and when Elena accidentally scratched it with her fingernail, a thin line of red appeared in the mark. "We're not in a building anymore," she said, backing away from the wall she'd marked. "This is something else, something that's pretending to be a building." I wanted to argue, to find a rational explanation, but the evidence was overwhelming. The corridors were definitely narrower now, and the ceiling was low enough that Jake, who was tallest among us, had to duck slightly. The floor beneath our feet felt soft, almost spongy, and our footsteps made wet sounds that had nothing to do with the marble tiles we'd walked on when we entered. The files were still updating themselves, and I found myself watching my own psychological deterioration in real time. The building was documenting not just our current states, but our responses to its documentation, creating an endless feedback loop of observation and reaction. "It feeds on us," I said, understanding flooding through me like ice water. It feeds on our fear, our confusion, our sanity, and the more it takes, the more real it becomes. Elena nodded, tears streaming down her face. The files aren't predictions. They're recipes, instructions for how to break us down systematically. Jake had stopped using the stethoscope, but he kept staring at it with an expression of growing horror. "It's not making sounds anymore," he said. "It's making music. Like a lullaby, but wrong somehow. Like it's trying to put us to sleep." The corridor ahead curved in a direction that hurt to look at directly, leading to areas of the building that couldn't possibly exist in normal space. Behind us, the path we'd taken had sealed itself, leaving only smooth, breathing walls. We were no longer escaping. We were being digested. And somewhere in the walls around us, the heartbeats continued, no longer mimicking our own rhythms but establishing their own, drawing us inexorably into synchronization with something vast and hungry and utterly inhuman. The files kept updating, documenting our final moments with clinical precision. But I couldn't tell anymore whether we were the patients or the symptoms, whether we were being treated or consumed, whether the building was trying to cure us or claim us. The last thing I remember clearly is the sound of my own voice, reading my final diagnosis aloud from a file that materialized in my hands. Patient successfully integrated into facility consciousness. Treatment complete. Recommend permanent residency. The rest is fragments. The feeling of walls closing in, not to crush, but to embrace. The sound of 3 heartbeats becoming one. The realization that the building had never been abandoned, that it had been waiting, patient and hungry, for exactly the right kind of food. And somewhere in the back of my mind, where rational thought still flickered like a dying candle, I wondered if we had ever really left the parking lot, if we were still standing outside the gate, staring at the condemned building and imagining what might be inside. But the heartbeats in the walls said otherwise, and they were getting stronger. Story 12. The chain-link fence had been cut years ago, its edges now rusted and sharp like broken teeth against the Sao Paulo skyline. I slipped through the gap behind Marcus and Tiago, my sneakers crunching on glass and debris that littered the hospital's abandoned grounds. The massive concrete structure loomed before us, its windows dark and hollow, like empty eye sockets in a skull that had been picked clean by time. "You sure about this, man?" Tiago whispered, his voice barely audible over the distant hum of traffic from the avenue beyond. The hospital had been closed since the 80s, they said. 40 years of decay and neglect, 40 years of stories that grew more twisted with each telling. Marcus just grinned and pulled out his phone's flashlight. The pale beam cut through the darkness as we approached the main entrance, where graffiti tags covered the lower walls like infected scars. The double doors hung off their hinges, one completely missing, leaving a mouth-like opening that seemed to exhale stale air carrying the scent of mold and something else, something medicinal that should have faded decades ago. We'd been talking about this place for months. Urban exploration was Marcus's latest obsession, and he'd been researching abandoned buildings around the city with the dedication of a scholar. The hospital São Vicente had captured his imagination completely. Built in the 60s to serve the growing northern districts, it had been one of the largest medical facilities in South America before budget cuts and corruption scandals forced its closure. Now it stood as a monument to bureaucratic failure, slowly rotting in the heart of one of the world's largest cities. The lobby stretched before us like a cavern, our footsteps echoing off cracked marble floors. Reception desks sat abandoned, their surfaces covered in a thick layer of dust that our passage disturbed, sending motes dancing in our flashlight beams. Wheelchairs clustered in corners like mechanical conspirators, and I noticed that some still held faded cushions, as if patients might return at any moment. "The surgical wing should be on the 3rd floor, Marcus said, consulting his phone. He'd downloaded building schematics from some urban exploration forum, treating this expedition with the seriousness of a military operation. That's where the interesting stuff usually is. The elevator doors stood permanently open, revealing a shaft that disappeared into absolute darkness. We took the stairs instead, our breathing growing heavier as we climbed. The stairwell was a canyon of concrete and rust, with handrails that felt sticky under my palms. Emergency lighting fixtures hung at odd angles, their plastic covers yellowed and cracked. By the time we reached the third floor, my shirt was sticking to my back with sweat. The hallway before us stretched into darkness, lined with doors that bore faded signs in Portuguese: Cirurgia Geral, Ortopedia, Cardiologia. The linoleum floor was warped and buckled in places, creating small pools of shadow that our lights couldn't quite penetrate. "This way," Marcus said, leading us down the corridor. Our footsteps seemed unnaturally loud, and I found myself walking on my toes, trying to muffle the sound. The walls were covered with institutional green paint that had peeled and bubbled, revealing patches of gray concrete underneath. Medical charts still hung from some doors, their pages yellowed and illegible. We passed a nurse's station where papers were scattered across the desk, as if the staff had just stepped out for a moment. A calendar hanging on the wall was turned to April 1987, its pages crisp with age. Coffee cups sat on the counter, their contents long since evaporated, leaving dark stains at the bottom like dried blood. The surgical wing announced itself with a pair of double doors bearing a faded red cross. Marcus pushed them open, and we stepped into a preparatory area filled with gurneys and IV stands. The wheels on the mobile equipment had all seized with rust, but everything remained positioned as if awaiting the next procedure. "Check this out," Tiago said, approaching a supply cabinet. Its glass front was intact, revealing shelves lined with instruments that gleamed dully in our flashlight beams. Scalpels, forceps, and other tools I couldn't identify lay arranged with military precision, as if they'd been cleaned and prepared yesterday. But it was Marcus who made the discovery that changed everything. He'd wandered ahead into the main operating theater, and I heard him call out with excitement, "Guys, you need to see this." The operating room was a cathedral of medical technology frozen in time. A massive surgical table dominated the center, surrounded by equipment towers and monitors. Above it, a cluster of surgical lights hung like mechanical flowers, their chrome surfaces tarnished but intact. The walls were lined with cabinets and instruments, and everything, absolutely everything, appeared to be in perfect working order. "This is incredible," Marcus said, running his hand along the edge of the surgical table. "It's like they just walked away and left everything running." That's when he did it. Marcus has always been one for dramatic gestures, and before either Tiago or I could stop him, he climbed onto the surgical table and lay down, spreading his arms wide and grinning up at the lights above. "Look at me, I'm getting my appendix out," he laughed. The lights turned on by themselves, not all at once, but in sequence, as if someone had flipped switches in a specific order. The surgical lamps blazed to life with the intensity of small suns, bathing the room in stark white light that made us all squint and step backward. But that wasn't the strangest part. The monitors came next. Banks of screens that should have been dead for 40 years suddenly flickered to life, displaying green lines that danced across their surfaces in familiar patterns: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation, all the vital signs of a healthy 22-year-old male, all matching Marcus perfectly. "What the hell?" Tiago whispered, backing toward the door. Marcus sat up on the table, looking around with a mixture of awe and growing concern. "There must be a generator," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Some kind of backup power that—" The monitors began beeping. Steady, rhythmic tones that matched the display of vital signs. Marcus's vital signs. I felt the hair on my arms standing up. "Get off the table," I told him, my voice coming out rougher than intended. He swung his legs over the side, but as soon as his feet touched the floor, alarms began sounding. Not the shrill wail of smoke detectors, but the complex, urgent tones of medical equipment. The kind of sounds that meant someone was dying. "Pre-operative procedures initiated," announced a synthesized voice from speakers I couldn't see. "Patient preparation in progress." The surgical table began to move. It didn't roll or slide like furniture being pushed. It glided with mechanical precision back toward the center of the room, as if guided by invisible hands. The monitors continued their incessant beeping, the green lines jumping and diving in perfect rhythm. "We need to leave," I said. no longer trying to hide the fear in my voice. "We need to leave right now." But when Tiago tried to push through the double doors, they wouldn't budge. He threw his shoulder against them, then tried pulling, but they remained as solid as if they'd been welded shut. Through the reinforced glass, I could see the hallway beyond, but it might as well have been on another planet. "Please remain calm," the voice continued. "Anesthesia will be administered shortly." Marcus was backing away from the table, which had stopped moving but continued to emit soft electronic chirps. The vital signs on the monitors were becoming erratic, jumping between normal ranges and dangerous spikes that should have indicated severe distress. I tried the doors myself, pulling and pushing with all my strength, but they remained immovable. The handles felt ice cold under my palms, and when I looked closely at the glass, I could see frost beginning to form around the edges. That's when I noticed the temperature dropping. Our breath began to mist in the harsh light of the surgical lamps. The electronic beeping was joined by the soft hiss of ventilation systems that shouldn't have been running. Air moved through the room in patterns I could feel against my skin, carrying scents of disinfectant and something organic that made my stomach clench. "The windows," Tiago said, pointing to the far wall where narrow panes of glass showed the city lights beyond. But when we approached, we found them sealed with what looked like surgical tape, layer upon layer creating an impermeable barrier. "Preparing surgical suite," the voice announced. "Estimated procedure time, indefinite." The monitors were showing impossible readings now. Heart rates in the hundreds, blood pressure that jumped between extremes, oxygen levels that fluctuated wildly. But Marcus was standing right there, breathing normally, his face pale but showing no signs of medical distress. I watched the screens, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The vital signs weren't random. They followed patterns like recordings being played back. Heart rates that spiked during moments of fear, blood pressure that dropped during periods of unconsciousness. It was as if the machines were displaying the final moments of every patient who had ever lain on that table. "It's reading all of us," Marcus said quietly. He was staring at the monitors with a fascination that worried me. "Look at the displays." He was right. Multiple sets of vital signs appeared on different screens, 3 distinct patterns that corresponded to our varying levels of panic. The machines were somehow monitoring all 3 of us simultaneously, tracking our terror with clinical precision. The surgical table began to move again, this time rotating slowly like a lazy Susan. The monitors adjusted their displays accordingly, maintaining their lock on our vital signs even as we shifted position in the room. "Patient records accessed," the voice said. "Medical history updated." New information began appearing on subsidiary screens. Names, birth dates, blood types, our personal information scrolling past in neat rows of text. But mixed in with accurate data were entries that made no sense. Previous surgeries we'd never had. Allergies to medications we'd never taken. Next of kin we didn't recognize. I found myself reading my own medical profile, fascinated despite my fear. According to the system, I'd undergone 17 surgical procedures, ranging from routine appendectomies to complex cardiac surgery. My blood type was listed as O negative, which was correct, but also as B positive and AB negative, as if multiple versions of me existed in the database. The temperature continued to drop. Our breath came in thick clouds now, and I could feel the cold seeping through my clothes. The surgical lights blazed overhead, but they provided no warmth, only harsh illumination that made everything look corpse pale. "Surgical team report to OR 7, the voice commanded. "Emergency procedures required." Footsteps echoed in the hallway beyond the doors. We all heard them clearly, the soft squeak of rubber soles on linoleum, the rustle of surgical scrubs, the quiet conversation of medical professionals discussing patient care. But when we pressed our faces to the glass, the hallway remained empty. The sounds continued, growing closer, as if an entire surgical team was approaching our location. The monitors began displaying new information: surgical schedules, procedure codes, post-operative care instructions. Everything was being prepared for operations that couldn't possibly happen, using equipment that had been abandoned for decades. "They're coming," Tiago whispered, still pressed against the door. I can hear them getting closer. The footsteps were right outside now, accompanied by the rattle of surgical instruments and the quiet hum of conversation. Through the glass, shadows moved, shapes that suggested human figures but remained somehow insubstantial, like reflections on water. Preparing for multiple simultaneous procedures, the voice announced. Patient consent assumed. 3 surgical tables rose from floor panels I hadn't noticed before. They emerged with mechanical precision, taking positions around the room like altar stones in a temple. Each was equipped with restraints that hung open like hungry mouths, waiting to receive their occupants. The vital signs displays now showed our terror in real time, tracking every spike of adrenaline, every skip of our hearts. The machines fed on our fear, grew stronger from our panic, and I began to understand that this wasn't about the building being haunted or possessed. This was about the building being alive. Somewhere in the past 40 years, the hospital had developed its own consciousness, fed by decades of pain and healing, birth and death, hope and despair. It had awakened with an insatiable hunger for patience. The equipment didn't just monitor vital signs, it sustained itself on them, drawing energy from the electrical impulses of living hearts and minds. And now it had found us. The surgical tables moved closer, their restraints reaching out like mechanical tendrils. The monitors displayed our complete medical futures, endless procedures, eternal recovery periods, permanent residence in rooms that would never release us. I pressed my hand against the glass of the doors, feeling its impossible coldness burn my palm. On the other side, the shadows had taken more definite shape. Doctors and nurses moved through the hallway, their faces hidden behind surgical masks, their eyes reflecting no light. "We're going to be patients here forever," Marcus said, his voice dreamy and distant. He was staring at the nearest surgical table with an expression I'd never seen before. Not fear, but acceptance. "We're going to be taken care of." The restraints on his assigned table stretched toward him like eager pets greeting their master. The monitors showed his heart rate settling into a steady rhythm, his blood pressure normalizing, as if his body was already preparing for permanent medical care. I wanted to grab him, to shake him back to awareness, but I found my own attention drawn to the table that had risen for me. It looked comfortable, equipped with warming blankets and IV ports already positioned for easy access. The monitors promised careful observation, constant care, eternal vigilance over my health and well-being. The building would take care of us. It would monitor our vital signs, track our recovery, ensure we never had to worry about the outside world again. We would become permanent residents of a hospital that had been waiting 40 years for new patients, living patients. The doors finally opened, but not to let us out. The surgical team entered, figures in green scrubs whose faces I couldn't quite focus on, carrying instruments that gleamed with impossible brightness. They moved with the practiced efficiency of medical professionals who had been performing the same procedures for decades. I felt hands guiding me toward my table, gentle but irresistible. The restraints felt soft against my wrists. The IV needle slipped into my arm with minimal discomfort. The monitors showed my vital signs settling into healthy, sustainable patterns. The last thing I remember clearly was the surgical light moving into position above my face, its brightness washing away all thoughts of the world beyond these walls. In that moment, I understood that I would be cared for here, fed intravenously, monitored continuously, protected from all the dangers and uncertainties of life outside. The hospital had been waiting so long for patients who would never leave. And now we never would. But sometimes, in moments between the medications they give me, I wonder if any of this is really happening. If maybe I'm lying in a real hospital somewhere, recovering from some accident or breakdown, and all of this is just the fevered dream of a mind trying to process trauma. The other patients, Marcus and Tiago, seem happy enough. When we're allowed to visit during recreational periods, they speak fondly of their treatments, their procedures, their ongoing care. The staff is always professional, always attentive to our needs. I've been here long enough now that I can't quite remember what the outside world looked like. The windows in our rooms show only white light, and the calendar on the wall is permanently set to April 1987. Sometimes I think I hear voices calling from beyond the building. Friends, family, people looking for 3 university students who disappeared one night while exploring an abandoned hospital. But the medications help with that. They help with a lot of things. The doctors say I'm making excellent progress. My vital signs are perfect. My recovery ahead of schedule. They're very pleased with how well I'm adapting to permanent residency. And most of the time, I believe them. Most of the time. Story 13. The rust-colored light of dusk had already begun to fade when I first saw it. A lean, dark figure moving through the skeletal remains of the industrial complex. At first glance, it could have been anything. A stray dog, maybe, or debris caught in the evening wind. But something about its movement, the deliberate way it seemed to flow between the concrete barriers and twisted metal, made me pause with my finger hovering over the camera's shutter. I'd been tracking a family of red foxes for 3 weeks, following rumors from locals about unusual wildlife behavior near the abandoned Hartwell manufacturing plant. The place had been shuttered for over a decade, leaving behind a graveyard of corroded machinery and overgrown foundations that nature was slowly reclaiming. It was exactly the kind of liminal space where wildlife thrived, hidden from human interference. The figure moved again, this time more distinctly. Black against the deepening gray of twilight, it slipped between 2 collapsed concrete walls with an almost liquid grace. My telephoto lens captured it in a series of rapid frames. Click, click, click. The motor drive of my old Nikon cutting through the evening silence like a mechanical heartbeat. Through the viewfinder, the shape appeared more solid, more defined. Roughly human in proportion, but somehow wrong in its movements, as if it were navigating by a different understanding of space and gravity. When I lowered the camera to observe with naked eyes, it had vanished entirely. The rational part of my mind, the part trained by 15 years of wildlife photography, suggested a dozen explanations. Poor lighting conditions, optical illusions created by the interplay of shadows and industrial debris, perhaps even a homeless person seeking shelter who'd spotted my presence and retreated. But my hands trembled slightly as I wound the film, and I found myself scanning the area with an intensity that had nothing to do with professional curiosity. The compound stretched out before me like the skeleton of some massive beast, its metal ribs reaching toward a sky that was rapidly losing its color. Puddles of standing water reflected what little light remained, creating mirrors that seemed to show depths they shouldn't possess. The air carried the scent of rust and decay, underlaid with something else, something organic that made my nostrils flare with instinctive wariness. I made the decision that would haunt me for months afterward. I decided to stay. Setting up camp in these conditions wasn't ideal, but I'd done it before in far worse places. The wildlife photographer's life is one of patience and adaptation, of learning to become part of the landscape until the world forgets you're there. I found a relatively sheltered spot between 2 concrete barriers, close enough to the area where I'd spotted the figure to maintain visual contact, but far enough back to avoid disturbing whatever might emerge. My small dome tent went up quickly, muscle memory guiding my hands through the familiar motions, even as my eyes continued to sweep the compound. The portable camp stove followed, then my sleeping bag and equipment cases creating a small circle of human habitation in the midst of industrial decay. By the time I had everything arranged, full darkness had fallen, leaving only the weak glow of my headlamp and the distant orange haze of the city's light pollution. That's when the real strangeness began. I had positioned myself with a clear view of the area where I'd seen the figure, camera ready on its tripod, motor drive loaded with fresh film. The plan was simple: wait, watch, and document whatever emerged. But as the hours crawled by, I began to notice things that made my skin crawl with an unnameable dread. The first was the silence, not the comfortable quiet of wilderness areas, where the absence of human noise allows natural sounds to emerge, but a profound, oppressive stillness that seemed to press against my eardrums. No insects chirped, no small animals rustled through the debris. Even the wind, which had been constant during the day, had died to nothing. The only sound was my own breathing and the occasional creak of settling metal somewhere in the darkness beyond my light. The second thing I noticed was the cold. Despite the mild spring evening, the temperature around my campsite seemed to be dropping steadily. My breath began to mist, and I found myself pulling on layers that should have been unnecessary. But the cold wasn't uniform. It came in waves, washing over me like invisible tides, sometimes so intense that my teeth chattered, followed by periods of normal temperature that left me questioning whether I'd imagined the chill. By midnight, I had taken over 24 photographs of empty space, or at least that's what I thought I was photographing. Through the camera's viewfinder, I could see nothing but shadows and architectural debris illuminated by my flash. But something compelled me to keep shooting, to document the seemingly empty areas where my peripheral vision kept catching glimpses of movement. Each time I turned to look directly, there was nothing there. The ritual became hypnotic. Point, focus, shoot, wind. Point, focus, shoot, wind. The mechanical repetition seemed to calm my increasingly frayed nerves, providing a structure that kept the growing sense of wrongness at bay. But even that small comfort was shattered when I began to notice that my flash seemed to be revealing things that weren't visible to my naked eyes. Shadows that were too sharp, too defined for the diffuse illumination my strobe provided. Shapes that suggested presence without revealing form, and in 3 separate shots, what appeared to be the outline of that same lean, dark figure I'd seen at dusk, but closer, much closer. In the first image, if it was indeed an image, and not some trick of light and shadow, the figure appeared to be roughly 50 yards away, partially obscured by a collapsed wall. In the second, taken perhaps an hour later, it seemed to have moved to within 30 yards of my position. The third shot, captured just after 2 a.m., showed what might have been the same shape less than 20 feet from the edge of my small circle of light. But when I lowered the camera after each shot, peering into the darkness with my headlamp, there was nothing there. The rational explanations I'd clung to earlier began to crumble under the weight of accumulated strangeness. Camera malfunctions didn't create consistent, progressive movement patterns. Optical illusions didn't maintain coherent shapes across multiple images, and homeless individuals, no matter how skilled at concealment, didn't move without disturbing the accumulated debris that littered the ground. As the night wore on, my professional detachment gave way to something approaching panic. The silence pressed against me like a physical weight, broken only by the sound of my own increasingly rapid breathing and the mechanical whir of the camera's motor drive. The cold came in more frequent waves now, each one seeming to penetrate deeper into my bones. And through it all, the persistent sensation that I was being watched by something that stood just beyond the reach of my light. By 3 a.m., I had stopped looking through the viewfinder altogether. The act of pointing the camera into the darkness and seeing those shapes, those suggestions of presence, had become unbearable. Instead, I sat hunched in my sleeping bag, camera clutched in hands that shook from more than just the cold, trying to convince myself that dawn would bring clarity and reasonable explanations. But clarity, when it came, only deepened the mystery. The morning light revealed a campsite that looked exactly as I remembered setting it up, with one exception. The ground around my tent was marked with what appeared to be footprints, not human prints. The proportions were wrong, too long and narrow, with suggestions of toes that didn't quite align with any anatomy I recognized. They formed a rough circle around my sleeping area, as if something had spent the night pacing around me, staying just outside the reach of my light. I photographed the prints from every angle, using both black and white and color film, documenting their size and spacing with the methodical precision that professional training had drilled into me. But even as I worked, doubt gnawed at my confidence. The ground was soft mud mixed with industrial runoff, exactly the kind of surface that should hold clear impressions. Yet these prints seemed somehow too perfect, too precisely formed, as if they had been pressed into the earth by something that understood the concept of leaving tracks without quite understanding the mechanics of how tracks were actually made. When I finally packed up my equipment and hiked back to my truck, I carried with me 4 rolls of exposed film and a growing certainty that something fundamental had shifted in my understanding of the world. The drive back to my dark room passed in a blur of highway miles and radio static, my mind cycling through increasingly implausible explanations for what I'd experienced. The truth, or what I interpreted as truth, emerged in the developer baths of my makeshift darkroom. The photographs from the early evening were exactly what I expected. Empty industrial landscapes captured in the harsh contrast of electronic flash. But as the night progressed, the images began to show anomalies that made my hands shake as I guided them through the chemical baths. Shadows that fell in directions inconsistent with my flash position, areas of darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And in every image taken after midnight, the unmistakable suggestion of a presence that grew progressively closer to my position. The final roll of film contained images that challenged my sanity. In the last dozen frames, the figure was clearly visible, not as a suggestion or a trick of light, but as a definite shape that cast shadows and blocked background details. It appeared to be standing just at the edge of my light's reach, motionless but somehow radiating an intensity that was palpable even in the static medium of photography. The shape was humanoid, but wrong in ways that my mind struggled to process. Too tall, too thin, with proportions that suggested joints bending in directions that anatomy shouldn't allow. And in the final frame, the last photograph I'd taken before abandoning my camera for the remainder of the night, the figure appeared to be reaching toward the lens. I stared at that image for what felt like hours, a magnifying glass trembling in my grip as I examined every detail. The figure's arm, if it could be called an arm, extended into the frame with fingers that seemed to multiply the closer I looked, creating an effect like motion blur except that everything else in the image was perfectly sharp. Its face, if it had one, was lost in shadow so complete that it seemed to be a void in the photographic emulsion itself. But it was the background details that finally broke my nerve. Behind the figure, clearly visible in areas where its body didn't block the view, were the familiar shapes of my campsite. My tent, my equipment cases, even the reflection of my own position behind the camera. The figure wasn't standing 50 feet away, as perspective would suggest. It was standing directly in front of me, close enough that I should have been able to feel its breath. The film went into the fire that same evening. I told myself it was the rational choice, the only way to put an end to whatever psychological episode I'd experienced. The negatives curled and blackened in the flames of my fireplace, releasing acrid smoke that made my eyes water. But as the last frame dissolved into ash and carbon, I noticed something that made my blood freeze in my veins. The fire cast dancing shadows on the walls of my living room, familiar patterns of light and darkness that any photographer would recognize. But among those normal, explicable shadows, other shapes moved. Thin, elongated forms that stretched across my walls with impossible length, reaching toward corners where no light source should have been able to project them. And in the pattern of shadows and flame light reflected on my hardwood floor, I began to see the formation of shapes that looked disturbingly like footprints. As I watched in horror, the shadowy impressions began to trace a path around my chair, circling me just as the prints in the mud had circled my tent. They moved with deliberate purpose, each one forming for a moment in the interplay of firelight and darkness before fading, only to be replaced by the next in sequence. Around and around they went, drawing closer with each revolution, until I could swear I felt the pressure of an invisible presence settling into the chair beside me. The fire burned out hours ago, but I can still see them. The footprints. They continue their endless circuit around my living room, visible now even in broad daylight, pressed into shadows that shouldn't exist and catching light from sources that aren't there. They've worn a path in my perception, a track that my eyes follow compulsively even when I try to look away. I've stopped taking photographs. The camera sits on its shelf, lens cap secure, film compartment empty. But sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch the flash of something lean and dark moving through the familiar spaces of my home. When I turn to look, there's nothing there. Just the suggestion of movement, the memory of motion that my peripheral vision insists it witnessed. The rational explanations I once clung to have become whispers in a wind I can no longer feel. Sleep deprivation, perhaps. Stress-induced hallucinations brought on by too many months of solitary work. Carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace. Chemical exposure from improperly ventilated darkroom sessions. My mind catalogs each possibility with the methodical precision of professional training, but the footprints continue their circuit regardless of what labels I apply to them. I've considered seeking help, but how do you explain to a doctor that you're being stalked by something that may exist only in the spaces between light and shadow? How do you describe the sensation of being constantly observed by eyes that cast no reflection, of sharing your space with a presence that leaves no trace except in the corners of perception, where certainty becomes doubt? Instead, I find myself returning to that abandoned industrial complex, drawn by a compulsion I can't name or resist. The rational part of my mind screams warnings about obsession and breakdown, but my feet carry me back to that place where the boundaries between real and imagined first began to blur. Each visit reveals new details, more prints in the mud, shadows that fall at impossible angles, and in the distance, always in the distance, the suggestion of movement that my eyes can never quite focus on. The camera remains at home, but I no longer need it to document what I see. The images are burned into my memory with the permanence of chemical fixative, developing in the darkroom of my mind with each passing day. And sometimes, when the light is just right, and my peripheral vision catches movement where none should exist, I wonder if the figure was ever in the photographs at all. Perhaps it was always in the photographer. The footprints circle closer now, wearing their path through spaces that exist somewhere between perception and reality. And in the growing darkness of evening, I can feel something settling into the chair beside me, patient and motionless, waiting for me to finally turn and acknowledge its presence. I think I'm beginning to understand why I can never quite see it directly. I think it's because I'm looking in the wrong direction. I think I need to look behind me.